The lifeless body of an amateur boxer is found in the middle of nowhere.
He'd been beaten, bound, and left.
Coroner says manual strangulation.
He doesn't just want him to die, he wants to feel him die.
The investigation stalls until a surprise witness steps forward.
She thought she was going to be implicated in a murder.
We need something to support what this woman says.
To get to the truth, detectives will need to get their hands dirty.
I said, I think you're going dumpster diving.
Sometimes you have to do nasty things to solve a crime.
When you begin a murder investigation, you're poking in the dark. But once you actually get to a point of getting solid information, the sun comes out. That's a great moment.
There's one thing that never changes: murder.
Douglas Wagner was out enjoying the beautiful weather about 15 miles north of Colorado Springs in El Paso County. I think a lot of people live here because we have such great weather most of the time to be outdoorsy. He started smelling something funny. And kind of buried loosely under some branches. And he sees a dead body.
The next day, Sergeant Joe Kenda meets with Detective Steve Gansel of the El Paso County Sheriff's Office.
So how's this new sheriff of yours?
I like him. Shaking things up, but in a good way.
I often meet with other detectives from other agencies, particularly El Paso County. We often work together on cases of common interest or cases that cross jurisdictional lines.
Here you guys go.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
I have been craving meatloaf like you wouldn't believe.
I absolutely love having lunch with Joe and to sit over and talk about what we have going in the sheriff's office.
So what's this new case you're working on?
The guy went hiking in the woods and found himself a dead body.
Wow. Looks bad.
My appetite has never been spoiled. You get very accustomed to dealing with death as anything else. It just doesn't. On one occasion, we ordered pizza. We had it delivered to the crime scene.
Happened in our jurisdiction, just outside of Woodmore, but we could use some of your help.
Sure. So what do you know so far?
Gansel explains the body was located in a remote wooded area.
The victim appears to be a black male. He's early to mid-20s. He's very well built, maybe a bodybuilder or athlete of some sort.
It was apparent that there was some effort to conceal the body.
All right, let's get this stuff off him.
Once all the debris was moved, the body was rolled over.
Oh, damn.
He is bound, both his wrists and his feet, with shoelaces. Not bound very tightly, but bound nonetheless. There are drag marks where this body is found. So this person is transported to that disposal site, most likely by automobile. The body is removed from the car, dragged to where it's left, and then covered up.
He's got no wallet on him.
Somebody really took their time with this guy.
It was very apparent that the victim had been beaten severely about the face. There was still blood coming from the nose. Inside the mouth was material from some type of a jacket.
So was he beaten to death?
Nope. Coroner says manual strangulation.
Interesting.
I thought so.
Manual strangulation says they know this person, and this person is enraged. He doesn't just want him to die, he wants to feel him die.
Coroner gives us time of death anywhere from 2 to 7 days ago. Other than that, I got nothing.
So how can I help?
I'd like to figure out who this guy is, run his fingerprints. I was hoping maybe you could ask around, see if anybody matching his description what reported missing around then.
Consider it done.
Here's the rest of the case report.
The most complete records of people and criminals and so on are maintained by the Colorado Springs Police Department. So we very often share information with the Sheriff's Department.
If we don't find anything in our files, so reach out to the media.
I really appreciate that, Joe.
Whenever you're ready, guys.
Thank you. This one's on me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Person's report from the past month.
Since there is no identification on the remains, no documents of any kind, I'm checking to find someone who's of same physical appearance as this guy. Black male, probably in his 20s, 5'7" to 5'8", 150 pounds, athletic build.
Nothing here. How about you?
Nothing.
All right, let's try Crime Stoppers. Yeah, can you please put me through to KKTV?
In 1988, I was a news anchor for KKTV, the CBS affiliate in Colorado Springs. Back then, the only way the police department had to get out information to the public was through the news media and Crime Stoppers.
If you see any suspicious activity, please call us at Crime Stoppers.
Crime Stoppers is an organization within the city and county that maintains informant files for individuals who call the police and report intelligence information they've gathered from the street.
Please call us at Crime Stoppers. We need your help to stop these crimes.
Over the next 2 days, calls about Detective Gansel's John Doe begin to trickle in.
Good morning, Sergeant.
I get Crime Stopper tips every morning, and I review those. The problem is, a lot of Crime Stopper tips aren't useful. But we get one informant that calls in that says she knows this guy, and his name is Doc. The last time she saw him was this date, and he looks like this. That lines up with our unknown victim. So we referred that to Gansel right away.
This is Gansel.
Hey, Steve, it's Kenda.
You may want to talk to this person.
Hours later, the caller meets investigators at the morgue.
Are you sure you're okay to do this?
The visual identification is one of the least chosen ways in law enforcement to identify a body. There is a high degree of anxiety, not knowing if in fact it is going to be the person they know, and that's going to be that everlasting view that'll never go away.
Look, this may or may not be your friend, but either way, it's not going to be easy.
You prepare the person, take your time, and if you need more time, you need to sit down, we'll stop the viewing at that point.
You ready?
Yeah.
Please.
Oh my God.
She yells out, "Oh my God, that's my friend Doc."
There is nothing worse than watching a loved one identify a body, but it must be done. Now we need to find out who this Doc is and why he ended up on a morgue table. The El Paso County Sheriff's Department not only had a whodunit, they had a who is it. We now have a witness who's come forward that says his name is Doc. So it is a beginning for the case.
So you don't know Doc's real name?
No, I haven't known him that long. Maybe a month.
How do you know him? Look, you can be honest with me. All I care about is catching whoever it is did this to your friend.
Okay, I scored H from him.
She described Doc as coming from New York, that he had been in Colorado Springs a short time and was a street-level drug dealer. She had purchased heroin from him.
That's what got him in trouble. Something happened with the guys that he got the drugs from.
How do you know that?
The weirdest thing happened right before he disappeared.
She said she was minding her own business.
Doc?
I don't know. I haven't seen him all day.
She was absolutely terrified of these two men.
Tell Doc, the big time.
So they drove off. And then a couple days later, I saw them at the bar. And they said, don't worry about looking for Doc. Took care of it.
Do you know any of their names?
No. All I know is they supply most of the dealers in the area. And I heard that they have connections to a Panamanian cartel.
Possible that he has crossed swords with these Panamanian drug dealers, and they took revenge by killing him. If you're in the drug business, they might even make a mistake and believe that you owe money that you don't owe. It's a very bizarre world, which is why it's not in your interest to become involved in it.
Look, here's my card, in case you think of anything else. And again, I'm sorry for your loss.
Later that day, Gansel brings Kenda up to speed.
So maybe Doc owed these guys money. They track him down, beat him up, and ultimately strangle him.
Yeah, that would explain why he was bound. Why they interrogated him.
Drug people have a strict code. Don't pay me, you steal my drugs, I'm going to kill you. And they do. They carry out that threat because the only thing they can survive on is their reputation. And if it's drug dealers in the plural, could this explain tying up and torture and punching and who knows?
So we're thinking to connect the Panamanian cartel?
Yep.
Oh, I got this.
Oh, thanks, man.
Keep the change.
Thanks.
Thanks, Karen.
And Kenda encounter an unexpected setback.
This is Gansel.
Hi, this is Tina.
The witness called in and stated that she had received a telephone call from Doc. And Doc had informed her that he had left Colorado Springs.
He's in Texas, he's fine. Oh, great.
I'm so sorry. I really thought that the guy you showed me was him.
It's hard to identify a body in that condition.
It doesn't happen often, but it can happen that people see what they want to see.
Did Tina imagine this was her friend Doc because of all of the drugs she has floating around in her system, or is she just lying? Who knows? This is the world of delusions and illusions where drug users dwell. Maybe it's time to find some new friends, Tina.
It's very frustrating that you have a good lead that sounds like you're going to go somewhere, and then the very next day is gone.
Thanks for letting me know.
What's up?
Good news. Just heard back from Quantico. This fax just came in.
So the FBI ran the victim's prints in a national database and got a hit. This person is John Bernard, 3 years of age.
Through the records, it showed that Johnny Wilson was living with his mother in Denver.
Johnny Wilson?
Is this about Johnny? Did you find him?
Maybe it'd be better if I came inside.
When you stand at someone's door day or night and you're wearing a coat and tie and they haven't seen their family member sometime, then they generally know why you're there. It's very difficult.
I had high hopes for Johnny. Everybody did. Son was a boxer, a great boxer. He was gonna go pro.
She and her son, Johnny, lived in the state of Nevada, and he started boxing when he was 15 years old, and he had a real talent.
She said by the time he reached the age of 18, he was a heavyweight Golden Gloves champion within the state of Nevada.
Explains that until Johnny Wilson could fight his way up to the more lucrative matches, he had to work as a bouncer to pay the bills.
And that's when it happened. It was just bad luck.
See that when we get outside? accident. Fuck, break your face in. Man, I ain't scared of you. Hey, guys, chill out. Chill out. Chill out. That's what you do. That's what you do. Get out of here.
During the course of breaking up a fight, he was shot in the chest. She said the bullet remained in the chest. The doctors didn't remove it.
That limited his breathing ability and his ability to stay in excellent shape.
He was forced to stop boxing. After that, he was just lost.
When you have a dream like that and you're on your way and it's taken away from you so suddenly at a young age, it's going to affect your life in ways that you can't even imagine.
He got on drugs. So we moved out here to Denver to get him away from all of that.
Did that work out?
Yeah, he was clean. But he was still just so down on himself until he ran into one of the boxing coaches from the USA boxing team.
Johnny Wilson.
Yeah.
I will never forget your knockout at the Golden Gloves Championship, man.
Man, that was amazing. That was a long time ago.
Yeah, man, it was incredible. It was Holly Shuffle. 1, 2.
Oh, wow.
Bang, man. You hit him.
Damn.
Yeah, you training here in Denver?
Oh, I gave it up a while ago.
Johnny told that guy about his health, and he was convinced he could help my son.
The mother also said that he was told if he could overcome his breathing issues with the right kind of coaches, he could perhaps resume his career.
So he then moved himself down to Colorado Springs and began to train once again.
She said she was so happy that her son had found this new lease on life. But about a month ago, she started to sense that something was wrong.
What do you mean?
He was sounding really anxious on the phone. He wouldn't tell me what was wrong. I decided to find out myself.
Shonda drove down from Denver and finally found him. It was apparent that he was back on drugs.
It's got to be very sad and disheartening for a mother who had so much hope in her son to see him fall so quickly.
He looked terrible. He said he had something to take care of first. That's the last time I saw him.
Do you remember any of the people that he was with?
No, just some addicts, I think.
Why would she know? Her only concern was him.
Please, detective, you find the man that did this to my son.
I promise you we're going to do the best we can.
Knowing that we have a person living off the street, the chance of solving this one are becoming slimmer every day.
But lucky for Ganzel, Kenda has a new lead for him.
This is Ganzel.
Hey, Steve, it's Kenda.
Hey.
I got information from this woman. It says
Her husband and another guy might be involved in the killing.
We got a Crime Stoppers tip from a woman, and she tells this long story about how her husband and another guy are probably the ones that are involved in the death of Johnny Wilson.
I'm telling you, Steve, she had a lot of information we haven't put out to the media yet.
So when you get a Crime Stoppers tip that says a certain thing about the remains or a certain thing about the method of death, you know that's good information.
She might be the real deal.
I said, it just smells right, very right. And you need to get on this and bring in this woman, Lynn Chapman.
Miss Chapman, I'm Detective Ganzel.
I'm sorry, I couldn't find someone to watch my girl on such short notice.
Mike, would you be so kind and keep an eye on her while we talk?
Okay.
Thanks so much. Please have a seat.
I'm not sure where to start with all this. This involves my husband, Reggie. He saw that Crime Stoppers report and just went berserk.
She explains that her and her husband were living in this motel due to financial difficulties. They were trying to get back on their feet.
Why they gotta be putting it all over the news?
Was that Johnny they were talking about?
How am I supposed to know?
Was that Johnny?
You need to mind the damn business.
She said he's extremely physically strong, sometimes doesn't know his own strength, in her words. At one point, she said he put his hands around her neck so forcefully that she thought he was going to kill her. And she decided she needed to get away from him.
She went to her mother's house to seek safety. It was apparent that life.
All right, let's back up a minute. Why would you ask your husband if the victim on the news was Johnny?
Because I think I was there when my husband killed him.
Well, do tell Lynn, we've been hoping for someone like you to show up. We have an amateur boxer, Johnny Wilson, who has fallen into the drug world, who winds up getting murdered.
I'm really sorry.
We've already had one informant who completely took back everything she said to us. Now we have another informant that sounds like a really good one.
We have somebody stating that her husband was in fact the one that committed the homicide.
She also says that because they've had these problems in her marriage, he choked her once and she thought she was going to die. Now that's an important statement, because what is he doing to her? Manual strangulation. What did somebody do to Johnny Wilson? The very same thing.
So now the investigation is becoming more and more focused.
So how does Reggie know Johnny?
We met up with similar bad habits.
Which are?
Drugs. Reggie and Johnny do coke together.
Then Chapman described Johnny as a low-end drug user, drug supplier. He was a known associate to Reggie as to be able to supply drugs to him.
I think my husband and one of his friends gave him some money to buy some, because the night all this went down, I heard him shouting about it.
She describes that she and her daughter were in the back bedroom of this motel room.
Where's the money, Johnny?
I told you, man, I don't have it.
You're a liar. What you think, I'm stupid? You're dead to me.
Mommy, I'm scared.
Honey, it's okay. There's nothing to be scared of.
Just be patient. Just be patient.
I need my money now.
Keep Lydia away, kitty.
What the hell's going on?
Don't worry about it. Go back in the room.
Come on, man. Go get your money, man.
Oh, I swear to God, Johnny.
What's wrong?
I think they're playing a game, honey. Come on, let's go back to bed. I closed the door, but things just got worse.
She turned the TV in the room on to occupy her daughter, but she's still crying with all this disturbance going on.
After about an hour of what she describes it as some type of an altercation going on, it becomes quiet.
She opens the door and looks.
He just passed out. We're gonna throw him out in the cold. Now go to bed.
She sees Johnny wrapped up in 2 blankets, and there's blood all over the carpet. She then sees Reggie and his friend putting Johnny in the trunk of a maroon 4-door car, and they drive off.
So who was the guy that was in the room with Reggie and Johnny?
Jerome.
Do you have a last name?
She doesn't know Jerome's last name. She thinks he might be in the Army or he was recently out of the Army. She doesn't really know that much about him.
So what about Reggie? Is he still at the motel?
I guess. I moved out after he got physical with me. We've been living at my mother's, but I'm really scared he's gonna come looking for me.
This story that she tells Genzel makes absolute perfect sense for what someone would do trapped in the circumstances in which she found herself. Her concern is her family. It makes her believable, in my opinion.
Look, I promise you we're gonna look into this, okay? Thank you so much for coming and chatting with us.
It was apparent that Lynn needed safety. We contacted the Colorado Department of Human Services. Arrangements were made to put Lynn into a safe house.
So they have a place to stay where no one knows where they are until they can get Reggie into custody and also identify and arrest Jerome.
With his last known address.
Let's go to the motel room for 2 reasons. We may not find Reggie, but we're certainly going to find bloody carpet. That's an important piece of evidence.
You understand you got a guest staying here by the name of Reggie Chapman?
We did. He checked out early this morning. I'd like to see his room.
Yeah, all right, sure.
So the manager takes his master key. We open the door and we look in this room.
Son of a bitch.
Much to our surprise, the carpet that was once in there had been removed.
We took the carpet out this morning after Mr. Chapman moved out.
Why?
Unfortunately, a lot of these tenants trash the carpets. That's why we buy the really cheap ones. This one is pretty gross. We just took it out a few hours ago.
So where's the carpet now?
In the dumpster, I guess.
You've got to be kidding me.
We look in the dumpster, and it's empty.
I guess the trash man must have picked it up already.
So now, knowing that it was within such a short time frame, I just had to find out which company picked it up, which dump it went to, and then go to that dump and find that carpet.
There's a transfer station not far from here. Our garbage usually ends up there before going to the county landfill, so I don't know if that helps.
I hope that's not a new suit you got on.
I looked at Gensel and I said, I think you're going dumpster diving.
Wasn't exactly on my agenda when I got dressed this morning.
Thank you.
All right.
Are you going to find it? Maybe. Are you not going to find it? That's also maybe. But you have to try. You can't just throw up your hands and say, well, they threw it away. Let's go look. We're assisting Gensel from the Sheriff's Department in his investigation of the murder of 23-year-old Johnny Wilson. We have learned there's bloodstains on the carpet, but it now resides in the county dump.
Detective Steve Gensel and his team are faced with the unpleasant task of wading through a mountain of garbage.
Gentlemen, the motel manager was nice enough to give me a sample from one of the other rooms. This is what we're looking for. No sense in putting it off. Let's get to it.
I had, so we started walking.
Being a homicide detective, everyone thinks it's very wonderful, oh my God, it's this really great mystery. A lot of it's just nasty, dirty, foul-smelling, filthy work.
There were dead animals and sewage, everything you could think of. The day was getting warmer and the smell was so thick. It was horrendous.
To get to the bottom of something, you have to go looking in places you wouldn't spend any time in if you could avoid it.
There's no escape, not even for lunch.
It's got to be here somewhere.
The life of a homicide detective is not glamorous. Sometimes you have to do nasty things to solve a crime.
But you're here for a reason. The reason is to find out who killed Johnny Wilson. That's the motivation.
After 5 hours of searching, a glimmer of hope finally appears.
Guys, over here.
We look down, it's like, Eureka! So I said, it's got to be our carpet. It just has to be.
That is a match.
Thank God. Can we go home now?
Help me get this to the lab.
We took it to our crime lab, and the blood samples that were found and the blood samples of Johnny Wilson that were recovered from the autopsy did match.
Gensel now has enough evidence for an arrest warrant, but at the moment, he only knows Jerome's first name, and Reggie Chapman is in the wind.
The next thing is now to find Reggie. He is the named assailant, the person that Lynn identifies as being involved in the assault of Johnny Wilson.
So in his search for Reggie, Gensel goes to Fort Carson. He's former employee of the United States Army.
Come in. Sergeant Courtney, Sheriff's Office like to have a word with you.
I'm Detective Gensel. Nice to meet you.
I learned the previous roommate to Reggie Chapman was Donald Courtney, and Courtney was asked to come down to the investigative division of the Army.
I understand you knew Reggie? Speak about his peers.
He describes that he started getting into cocaine. His attitude changed. He wouldn't take orders. He went AWOL.
Donald said that he had assaulted his wife and they sent him to the military jail on Fort Carson.
That led to a dishonorable discharge. I haven't seen him since.
He has no idea where he would be. He doesn't know any other friends he may have. And he never heard of anybody named Johnny Wilson.
We're also looking for someone he used to hang out a lot with, a guy named Jerome.
Jerome? Nah, no idea.
Okay, thanks for coming in.
Reggie had a funny habit of calling people by their middle names, so maybe Jerome is like a middle name.
That's interesting. I'll look into that, thank you.
No problem.
Dismissed.
Meanwhile, Kenda has continued to feed the press updates about the case, and his persistence finally pays off.
We get a Crime Stoppers tip that comes in, and I immediately get a hold of Genzel. We got another thing here that looks pretty good.
This guy claims one of the suspects is an ex-Army guy named Joey Brown.
Haven't heard that name, but Reggie was in the Army too.
Hey, by any chance, did your caller happen to mention
Middle name for this Joey Brown?
Jerome?
Oh, yeah.
This could be the Jerome that we've been looking for. We went to where he lived and informed him that there had been a Crime Stopper tip that he was involved in the murder of Johnny Wilson.
No, man, you heard it wrong. I wouldn't even be involved in something like that.
Maybe you saw something but didn't participate.
No. I mean, I don't even know what Johnny Wilson.
Joey stated he didn't have any involvement with him whatsoever.
But yeah, I'm sorry to say it, man. I gotta get out of here or I'm gonna be late for work. Is there anything else you need from me?
You mind if I take a picture of you? I'll clear you through the investigation a lot faster.
Sure.
Thanks.
Cool.
The intent of taking a photograph was to show that then to Lynn Chapman.
While Genzel isn't sure Joey Jerome Brown is his guy, the color of Joey's car catches his attention.
Knowing that Lynn Chapman saw the body wrapped in blankets in a maroon four-door vehicle, now everything is starting to come together.
So now Genzel contacts his star witness, Lynn Chapman.
Do you reckon?
That's him, but I'm not positive.
You're not positive?
I'm sorry.
It's all right.
Without positive identification, the likelihood is yes, but likelihood doesn't fly in a court of law.
Thanks so much for coming in. Hang on a second. Is your daughter here at the station with you?
Yes.
Didn't you say that she was there the night that you saw it happen?
Yes, my 6-year-old Lenny was standing right next to me.
Suddenly, Genzel sees another way forward.
We asked Lynn, would you mind if we see if your daughter can recognize anyone to supplement what you said?
Yes, that'd be fine.
Great.
So we bring the daughter in, explain to her that these aren't bad guys, these are good guys. You don't want to traumatize a little kid. We asked, is anyone in this photograph the same person that you remember being with your dad?
That man there. He was the one with my dad yelling at the other man.
You're positive?
Mm-hmm.
So we have a child who supports what her mother has been saying all along, that her daddy and this fellow named Jerome were yelling and screaming at a man named Johnny. Well, they were doing more than that, darling. They were killing Johnny. This case has come a long way.
That man there.
Thank you.
Once that identification is made, it's time to sign an arrest warrant for Reginald Chapman and for Joey Jerome Brown for the crime of first-degree murder.
As El Paso County Sheriff's deputies head out to arrest Jerome, SWAT is assembling outside an address where Reggie is believed to be hiding.
A woman calls Crime Stoppers and says that she knows Reggie Chapman and that he confessed to her that he killed someone, and she knows where he is staying.
Knowing that we're dealing with an individual who is excessively violent, arrangements were made with the motel staff to know which room that he was in.
Let's get him.
Sheriff's Department!
It's quite common when somebody opens the door and sees you, their first response is to close the door, as if that's somehow going to make you all go away.
Breacher up!
But what it makes happen is they crush the door.
Get on the ground! Get on the ground! Put your hands behind your back!
It's immediate surrender. And they took this guy into custody by showing overwhelming force.
You want an attorney, didn't want to make a statement.
Meanwhile, across town, Jerome is about to have his own encounter with law enforcement.
Yeah, man. I'll be there soon. All right.
Joey Jerome Brown.
He was also arrested without incident and taken into custody.
But before they head back to the sheriff's office, something else catches their eye.
They notice his maroon car in the parking lot.
They look inside of the vehicle and see stain remover, some nylon cord, a 7-inch knife.
Forensics, major crimes, and a record of tow's car, please.
Ultimately, all this was taken into evidence.
With Reggie Chapman not talking, Gansel focuses on his alleged accomplice.
Joey Jerome Brown waived his right to remain silent and offered information to assist through the investigation.
I'll tell you the whole story. I don't care.
Let's hear it.
He comes forward, and I didn't kill him. Reggie did. That's his motivation.
This whole thing started because Johnny said he was going to pick up some coke. He wanted to know if we wanted him to pick up some for us as well. We scraped together $100.
And what happened?
We waited a few days, and Johnny never showed up with our stuff.
Jerome says they became extremely mad and felt that they were ripped off.
Yeah, that's that bastard, man.
After several days of Reggie and Jerome searching the streets for Johnny, they finally found him.
What's up, Johnny? What's up, man?
What's going on, man? What's up, fellas?
Yo, you got my stuff?
Yeah, man. It's coming, man. Don't worry about it. My guy's just waiting for another shipment. That's all.
Anybody that buys drugs knows he's lying. They assume he used the money to buy drugs, which he's now got in his system.
You gonna get my stuff or our money, man? I'm not playing with you no more, man.
I ain't want no trouble.
Jerome explains that Reggie wanted to move their conversation inside, but tensions only escalated from there.
Come on, Reggie, take it easy. I'll get you your stuff, man.
Don't tell me to take it easy, punk.
Be patient, man. My guy always comes through, man. Come on. So we cool? Be patient. Just be patient out.
I need my money now.
What are you doing, man?
Reggie starts knocking him around, making demands, threatening him. He's gonna kill him.
Man, ain't got no money, man. Let me go, man.
Hey, yo,
ain't got no money.
check your shoes, man. Check your shoes.
It's a very common thing for street people to hide things in their shoes. I don't know why, but they do.
Yo, $31, that's all. That's all you got?
Jerome claims that's when Lynn came out and made the situation worse.
But that woman was crazy.
Nah, man, you just don't get it, man.
What the hell is going on in here? Just give Reggie his money. My kid's in there scared and can't sleep because of all this yelling and screaming. Just give him his money and get the hell out of here.
It's none of your business.
That's it, you're dead.
Not only did Johnny take money, but now he insulted Reggie's wife. That's the last straw. Johnny was a great boxer. Now he's just a dope addict. And he's a shadow of his former self, and he can't overcome Reggie. He is throttling him.
Yo. All right, Reggie. Reggie, chill, man. Yo, what you doing? Chill. Reggie, chill out, man. Reggie!
And he continues to strangle him until he goes limp.
And the deed was done.
Get a blanket, man. We gotta get his ass out of here.
They wrap up Johnny, and they take him out and stuff him in the back of the maroon four-door.
They drive up to Woodmore, north of the city. In a remote area, they take the body out of the trunk, they dump him, and they cover him up with leaves and branches and whatever else they can find.
I really didn't think that Reggie was capable of doing something like that. I really didn't.
Jerome's choice to come forward turned out to work for him. He pled guilty to 1 count of first-degree assault and 1 count of accessory to crime, was sentenced to 4 years in prison.
Reggie Chapman is found guilty of second-degree murder.
And he received 8 years in prison for the crime.
On the morning of May 27, 1963, somewhere in the province of Quebec, a man was arrested. His name was Leopold Dion. To anyone looking at him that day, he was not a monster. He was not standing in a dark alley with blood on his hands. He was not running from the police. He was not hiding beneath a false name or disappearing across a border. He was simply a middle-aged man being taken into custody. But behind that ordinary face was a story that would soon force an entire community to confront a terrifying question. The system itself becomes part of the tragedy. For years, Dion had moved through the criminal justice system, disappearing behind prison walls and eventually returning to society. He had already been convicted of a serious sexual offense decades earlier. He had already spent years in prison. He had already been released. And yet, in the spring of 1963, boys began disappearing. Not men. Not hardened criminals. Children. Boys who should have been worrying about school, summer, games, friends, and the small adventures that make up childhood. Instead, 4 of them would become names in one of Quebec's darkest criminal investigations. Guy Luckenock was 12 years old. Alain Carrier was 8. Michel Morel was 10. Pierre Marquis was 13. 4 boys. 4 families. For empty spaces that could never be filled again. And somewhere in the middle of those disappearances was a man who knew exactly how to make a child trust him. He had a story. He had a vehicle. And according to the accounts surrounding the case, he had learned that one of the easiest ways to get close to a child was to offer something that sounded harmless. A photograph. Imagine the scene. A boy sees an adult man approaching. The man does not look like a stranger from a nightmare. He looks to take a good picture. Someone who might promise an experience worth remembering. For a child, the proposition could sound almost magical. A photograph. A little adventure. A ride somewhere. Perhaps a quiet place away from the noise of the street. Nothing about those words, by themselves, sounds dangerous. And that is precisely what makes the story so disturbing. The danger did not announce itself. It wore an ordinary face. It arrived as an invitation. The first known killing in this series took place on April 20th, 1963. The victim was 12-year-old Guy Luckenock. At that point, no one knew that his disappearance would be the beginning of something much larger. A missing child is terrifying enough. But when a child disappears, the first instinct of a family is often hope. Maybe he went somewhere. Maybe he lost track of time. Maybe he is with a friend. Maybe he will walk through the door at any moment, embarrassed by all the worry he caused. Parents wait. They ask questions. They search familiar places. They listen for footsteps. They look down the road. They imagine the sound of a key turning in the lock. And every minute that passes makes the silence heavier. For Guy's family, that silence would eventually become permanent. His body would be discovered after Dion later location where the boy had been buried. But that knowledge came later. At first, there was only uncertainty. Then came May. On May 5th, 2 more boys disappeared. Alain Carrier was only 8 years old. 8. An age when the world is still supposed to be measured in simple things. Home. School. Friends. Family. A favorite place to play. A familiar road. A familiar voice calling your name. Alain was not alone in becoming a victim that day. 10-year-old Michel Morel also disappeared. 2 children. The same date. The same terrible pattern. And now, something was changing. A disappearance could be explained away, at least for a short time. 2 disappearances began to form a pattern. But patterns are often invisible when you are standing inside them. A family sees one missing child. A police officer sees a missing person report. A neighbor sees an empty place where a child used to be. It takes time before separate pieces begin to resemble the same picture. And while adults were trying to understand what was happening, the person responsible was still moving through the same world. That is perhaps the most unsettling part of this story. The killer was not operating from some distant, hidden place beyond society. He could speak to people. He could drive through communities. He could approach children. He could present himself as someone ordinary. And for a child, an adult who appeared confident and friendly could be enough. There was no warning label. No dramatic sign. No obvious indication that the man standing nearby was capable of terrible violence. Only a conversation. Only an offer. Only a moment of trust. Then came May 26th. Pierre Marquis was 13 years old. He would become the fourth boy whose death Dion later confessed to. By then, the nightmare had already taken shape. But the public did not yet know everything. The police did not yet know everything. And perhaps most importantly, the full scale of what had happened was still hidden beneath the ground. For children. For separate stories. But according to Dion's later confession, they were connected by one man. The next morning, May 27th, that connection would begin to emerge. A boy who had encountered Dion managed to escape. That escape would become one of the most important moments in the entire investigation. Because when a child survives an encounter that another child did not, the survivor carries something incredibly valuable. A memory, a face, a description, a fragmentation into a hunt for a suspect. And suddenly, the police had something to work with. The man they were looking for was no longer simply a shadow. There was a description. There was a direction. There was a possibility. And that possibility led investigators to Leopold Dion. He was arrested on May 27th, only one day after Pierre Marquis disappeared. But arresting a suspect is not the same thing as solving a crime. An arrest does not produce a body. It does not automatically explain where the victims are. It does not tell a grieving family what happened to their child. And it certainly does not guarantee a confession. At first, Dion did not simply open the door to the truth. He resisted. Questions met silence. Accusations met denial. Investigators had to work with what they knew and what they suspected. Somewhere beyond the walls of the interrogation room were 4 families desperate for answers. Somewhere were 4 children whose final moments were unknown. And somewhere were the places where their bodies had been hidden. The investigation would continue. Days would pass. Then weeks. And eventually, after prolonged questioning, Dion began to talk. What he revealed would transform the case. He confessed to killing 4 boys. And then came the most chilling part. He could lead investigators to them at a physical location. Every sentence could point toward another place. A road. A property. A hidden patch of earth. A place that had existed quietly while families searched desperately for their children. The investigators were no longer searching blindly. They were following the directions of the man they believed was responsible. And with each location, the scale of the horror became harder to deny. But there was another layer to the case. One that reached far beyond the spring of 1963. Because Leopold Dion was not an unknown figure to the justice system. His criminal history stretched back decades. In 1940, he had been convicted of raping a 33-year-old female teacher in Pont Rouge. He received a life sentence. A life sentence. Those words seem absolute. They sound like an ending. A door closing. A guarantee that the person who committed the crime would remain separated from society. But life sentences, like every other human institution, exist within systems of parole, release, supervision, and judgment. Dion would eventually return to society. And by 1962, he had been released conditionally. Less than a year later, children were dead. That fact would become one of the most disturbing elements of the case. Because the story of Leopold Dion, story of what happened after his first conviction. It raises questions about rehabilitation. About risk. About how authorities evaluate someone who has already committed a serious sexual crime. And about what happens when the danger is underestimated. These questions would remain long after the headlines faded. But on May 27, 1963, none of that history mattered as much as what investigators were about to uncover. Dion was in custody. The missing boys were still missing. And the clock was moving. The investigation would eventually lead police to the remains of the children. The confession would become central to the case. The public would learn the name Leopold Dion. And a phrase would become attached to him in Quebec's collective memory. The monster of Pont Rouge. But before that name became part of criminal history, there were 4 boys whose lives had nothing to do with monsters. Guy. Alain. Michel. Pierre. They had names before they became case numbers. They had families before they became evidence. They had voices. Habits. Faces. People who knew how they smiled. People who knew how they walked into a room. People who knew what they sounded like when they laughed. And somewhere there were probably ordinary memories. That matters. Because true crime can easily turn victims into statistics. 4 boys. 4 deaths. 1 killer. A neat sequence of facts. But real life is never that neat. When a child disappears, the loss does not begin with a courtroom verdict. It begins in a home. A chair that remains empty. A bed that is suddenly untouched. A pair of shoes that no longer moves from the doorway. A mother who looks at the clock. A father who keeps expecting to hear the front door. A family member who remembers the last ordinary conversation and replays it again and again, searching for some warning that was not there. The tragedy is not only that a child died. It is that an entire future disappeared with him. Birthdays that would never come. School years that would never be completed. Friendships that would never grow older. A first job. A first love. A family of his own. All the small, ordinary moments that make up a human life were erased in an instant. And this is where the story of Leopold Dion truly begins. Not with the man. With the absence he left behind. The spring of 1963 would become a turning point for Quebec law enforcement and for the families who had been forced to live through an unimaginable nightmare. Investigators would reconstruct. They would search locations. They would listen to a survivor. They would question Dion. And eventually, they would stand before the places where the missing boys had been hidden. But the road to justice would not be straightforward. There would be questions about evidence. Questions about which deaths could actually be proven in court. Questions about what Dion had confessed to and what prosecutors could establish beyond a reasonable doubt. Because there is a difference between knowing something happened and being able to prove it in a courtroom. That difference would become crucial. Dion had confessed to 4 killings. Yet the legal case would focus on 1. Pierre Marquis. 1 boy. 1 charge. 1 courtroom. 1 verdict. And eventually 1 death sentence. But even that would not be the end. Because Leopold Dion would not be executed. His sentence would later be commuted to life imprisonment. And almost a decade after the murders, another chapter would unfold behind prison walls. On November 17, 1972, Dion would die inside Archambault prison. Not at the hands of the state. Not by execution. But in an attack by another inmate. His name was Norman Champagne. The precise motives behind that attack remain less certain than the facts of Dion's conviction and imprisonment. Communities would eventually become the victim of violence himself. It is an ending that sounds almost too symmetrical. A murderer dies behind bars, killed by another prisoner. But there is no symmetry in what happened to the children. Nothing can balance it. Nothing can reverse it. Nothing can give their families back the years they lost. That is why the story cannot simply be told as the biography of a killer. The killer is only one part of it. The deeper story is about vulnerability. Trust. Missed warning signs. The terrifying ease with which an ordinary interaction can become something else. And the devastating consequences that follow when a dangerous person is allowed to move freely among people who have no reason to suspect him. Leopold Dion understood something that predators have understood throughout history. Children are taught to trust adults. They are taught to answer when an adult speaks to them. They are taught that a friendly stranger may simply be a friendly stranger. And when someone knows how to disguise danger as kindness, that trust can become a weapon. The tragedy of 1963 was not that 4 boys wandered into a world that was inherently evil. It was that an evil person learned how to make himself appear ordinary. That distinction matters. Because the most frightening monsters do not always look like monsters. Sometimes they speak softly. Sometimes they offer something harmless. Sometimes they have already been convicted once and still find their way back into the world. And sometimes, by the time everyone realizes what they have been looking at, the damage has already been done. In the weeks and months that followed the disappearance of the 4 boys, Quebec would begin to understand the scale of the horror. But for their families, there was never a single moment when the story began or ended. Their story began long before April 20th, 1963. It began with birthdays, with childhood, with ordinary mornings, with children leaving home and expecting to return. And for their families, it never truly ended. The investigation could end. The trial could end. The sentence could be changed. The prisoner could die. The newspapers could eventually stop printing his name. But grief does not follow the same calendar as a criminal case. It remains. Quietly. Year after year. And perhaps that is the most important thing to remember before we go any further. Leopold Dion became infamous. His name became associated with one of Quebec's most disturbing criminal cases. But the four boys did not choose to become part of history. They were simply children who had lives ahead of them. Until they met the wrong man. One child disappeared and another and another. The community was not yet looking at the completed picture. It was looking at fragments. A missing boy. A suspicious encounter. A description. A car. A man. A grave. Then another. Then another. Piece by piece, the image emerged. And when investigators finally saw what those pieces formed, there was no way to look away. For children had been taken. For families had been shattered. And at the center of it all stood Leopold Dion. A man who had already passed through the justice system once. A man who had already been given another chance. A man who would soon face a courtroom for one of the killings he confessed to. But before the trial, before the sentence, before the arguments and appeals, there was a much more painful question waiting to be answered. Who were the boys? What were their final days like? What did their families know? What did they believe when the children failed to come home? And how did an ordinary spring in Quebec become the beginning of a case that would haunt the province for years? To understand the horror, we have to step away from the courtroom, away from the headlines, away from the name that would eventually become synonymous with the case, and return to the beginning, to the children, to the communities where they lived, were in danger. Because before Guy Luckenock became the first known victim, he was simply Guy. Before Alain Carrier became a name in a criminal investigation, he was an 8-year-old boy. Before Michel Morel became evidence, he was a 10-year-old child with a life that should have continued. Before Pierre Marquis became the central figure in a murder prosecution, he was 13 years old. And before Leopold Dion became known as the Monster of Pont Rouge, he was simply a man walking through a world that had already given him one second chance. The next part of this story begins there. Not with death, but with life. With the world these boys knew, and with the people who loved them. Because if we are going to understand what was taken from them, we must first understand what they had. There is a strange thing about a disappearance. At first, it does not feel like history. It feels like a mistake. A child is late. That is all. A few minutes become half an hour. Half an hour becomes an hour. Someone checks the clock again. Someone looks outside. Someone asks a simple question. Where is he? There is still room for hope. Children get distracted. They stop to talk to friends. They take a longer route home. They forget the time. They make decisions that adults would never make. And so, though the mind protects itself, it chooses the explanation that hurts the least. He'll be back. He must be with someone. Maybe he went to a friend's house. Maybe he didn't hear us calling. Maybe he will walk through the door in 5 minutes. But then 5 minutes becomes 10. 10 becomes 30. The light outside changes. The familiar places have been checked. Friends have been asked. Neighbors have been questioned. And the sentence that no parent wants to say begins to take shape. Something is wrong. For the families connected to the Leopold Dion case, that sentence would become a reality. But what makes this case so haunting is the way the disappearances unfolded. They were not separated by years. They were compressed into a matter of weeks. The first known victim disappeared in April. Then 2 more boys disappeared on the same day in May. Then another boy vanished toward the end of that month. For children gone within a short period. And yet, from the perspective of the people living through those moments, the pattern could not have been immediately obvious. The families were living inside individual tragedies. They did not have the benefit of hindsight. They did not know what investigators would eventually discover. They did not know the name Leopold Dion. They did not know that a man with a criminal past was moving through the same world as their children, could become a trap. They only knew that their children had not come home. That is where the true horror begins. Not in a dark room. Not in a prison. Not in a courtroom. But in the ordinary space between expectation and realization. The place where a family waits for someone who is never coming back. April 20th, 1963. Guy Luckenock was 12 years old. The exact details of every ordinary moment that preceded his disappearance have been blurred by the passage of time. But the fact that remains is devastatingly simple. Guy left, and he did not return. Somewhere during that day, his path crossed with Leopold Dion. According to Dion's later confession, the encounter was connected to the same method he would use with other boys. Photography. A promise. A reason to go somewhere. A way of making an unfamiliar adult seem less unfamiliar. For a child, a camera can represent something exciting. A photograph is proof that a moment existed. A picture can make a child feel important. It can turn an ordinary afternoon into something worth remembering. And there was Dion presenting himself through that idea. He did not need to tell a child that he was dangerous. He needed the child to believe he was safe. That distinction is at the heart of this entire case. Sometimes they ask permission to enter. Sometimes they create the invitation themselves. Sometimes they make the child believe the decision was his. And that can make the memory of the crime even more painful for those left behind. Because after the truth comes out, families inevitably look backward. They replay the ordinary moments. They ask questions that have no answer. Could something have been noticed? Could someone have intervened? Could a different decision have changed everything? The human mind searches for a point where the story could have turned. But tragedy does not always provide one. There may be no dramatic warning. No obvious sign. Only an ordinary moment that becomes horrifying after you know what came next. For Guy's family, that day would eventually divide their lives into two parts. Before Guy disappeared, and after. The difference between those two worlds was impossible to measure. Before, the future was assumed. After, the future had to be imagined without him. The same would happen to the families of Alain Carrier, Michel Morel, and Pierre Marquis. But their stories would unfold differently. Because by May, the possibility of coincidence was becoming harder to accept. On May 5th, 8-year-old Alain Carrier disappeared. 8 years old. When we say that number today, it is easy to understand it intellectually of childhood. At 8, a child is still small enough to need an adult's hand in unfamiliar places. Still young enough to believe that adults usually know what they are doing. Still young enough for the world to be divided into safe places and unsafe places according to instinct rather than experience. An 8-year-old does not see a criminal history. He does not see a parole record. He does not understand the language of risk assessment. He sees a person. He hears a voice. He decides whether that person seems friendly. And sometimes that is all a predator needs. Alain's disappearance was followed by another. Michel Morel was 10. 2 boys. One day, 2 families suddenly facing the same nightmare. The disappearance of a child creates a particular kind of fear because the mind refuses to accept the absence. Adults search for evidence of life everywhere. A jacket, a bicycle, a footprint, a familiar object, anything that might indicate where the child went. And in those first hours, every possibility remains open. Maybe he is lost. Maybe he is hiding. Maybe someone has taken him. Maybe there has been an accident. Maybe he is still alive. Hope can be agonizing because it refuses to die. Even when the facts become darker, a parent can continue. The door opens. A face appears. A voice says, "I'm here." And everything stops. But for the families in this case, that moment never came. The disappearances were no longer isolated events. Something was happening. Yet even when investigators begin to suspect a connection, there is a danger in moving too quickly. A pattern can be real. A pattern can also be misleading. Every missing child has his own circumstances. Every witness remembers differently. Every report contains gaps. And in 1963, investigators did not have the technological tools that would later become standard in major criminal investigations. There was no digital trail, no mobile phone location history, no surveillance network covering every street, no database instantly linking every piece of information. Investigators had people, paper, telephone calls, descriptions, vehículos, witness statements, and memory. Memory is powerful, but memory is fragile, especially when the person trying to remember is frightened, especially when the person being remembered was seen only briefly, especially when the witness is a child. That is why the survival of another boy would become so important. Because one child, he had experienced the approach, and he managed to get away. That escape may have been only one moment in the middle of a much larger tragedy, but it changed the investigation. Suddenly, police had something they had not possessed before. A living witness. Someone who could say, in effect, "This is the man." And once investigators had a face to search for, the story began moving toward its inevitable confrontation. Leopold Dion. The name itself was not new to authorities. His past had already been documented. In 1940, Dion had been convicted of raping a 33-year-old teacher in Pont Rouge. He received a life sentence. For most people, a conviction like that would seem to mark the end of the story. The offender is removed. The victim is protected. Society moves forward. But criminal justice is not a single moment. It is a chain of decisions. A sentence. An appeal. A parole decision. A release. Supervision. Assessment. And eventually, another opportunity for a person to return to the community. Dion would eventually be released. By 1962, he had been granted conditional release. And less than a year later, the name that had already appeared in the criminal justice system would be. That sequence would later raise painful questions. What had been missed? What had been underestimated? Was the system too willing to believe that a person could change? Or had the warning signs simply not been understood in time? These are difficult questions because they do not have the simplicity of a villain and a hero. There was no single switch that could have prevented the tragedy. There were decisions made by institutions. Decisions made by individuals. Information that existed. Information that may not have been shared. Judgments about risk. Judgments about rehabilitation. And behind all of them were real human beings, including children who had no say in any of it. Then came May 26th. Pierre Marquis was 13. Another child. Another disappearance. By this point, the nightmare was becoming impossible to ignore. And the following day, the investigation would finally collide with the man at its center. May 27th. Dion was arrested. Only one day after Pierre Marquis disappeared. The speed of that arrest is one of the most striking aspects of the case. There was no long international manhunt. No years of living under a false identity. No dramatic escape. The man investigators were looking for was still close enough to be found. But an arrest is only the beginning. They needed to know where the boys were. They needed to establish whether the disappearances were connected. They needed evidence. And above all, they needed answers. Imagine sitting across from a suspect in an interrogation room. You know that 4 families are waiting. You know that somewhere there may be children who can still be found. You know that every minute matters. And sitting opposite you is the man who may hold the answers. But he does not have to give them. He can remain silent. He can lie. He can deny. He can change his story. He can make investigators question what they think they know. This is the psychological tension at the heart of an interrogation. The investigators know the suspect may be responsible. The suspect knows what happened. But knowledge is not evidence. And suspicion is not a confession. Dion initially did not simply reveal everything. It would take prolonged questioning before he began to confess. Approximately a month after his arrest, the story changed. The silence began to break. And with his words came something even more disturbing. Locations. Dion could guide investigators toward the places where the bodies had been buried. This is one of those moments in a criminal investigation when words stop being abstract. A confession can be written on paper. A confession can be spoken in a room. Investigators where to dig. The crime becomes physical. The past rises to the surface. The missing become victims. And a family's worst fear becomes something that can no longer be denied. The investigators followed. They searched. They found what they had been looking for. And each discovery carried a terrible confirmation. The children had not simply vanished. They had been killed. The case was no longer a missing person investigation. It was a murder investigation. And at its center was a man who had already been convicted of a serious sexual offense decades earlier. The deeper investigators went, the more disturbing the picture became. Dion confessed to 4 killings. But the legal system would later face a difficult problem. A confession does not automatically mean 4 convictions. Each individual murder must be established. Evidence must connect the accused to the specific crime. The prosecution must be able to prove its case in court. And this is where the story takes a turn that can easily be misunderstood. Dion confessed to 4 boys' deaths, but he was not convicted in court of 4 murders. The prosecution ultimately centered its case on Pierre Marquis. 1 victim, 1 charge, 1 courtroom. That distinction matters because history often compresses complicated cases. 4 victims, death sentence. But behind those labels is a complicated legal reality. 4 children could be dead. A suspect could confess to all 4. And still, the court may only be able to legally convict him of 1. For the families of the other boys, that distinction could never change what had happened. A courtroom's limitations do not make a death less real. A missing piece of evidence does not restore a child. A technical distinction between confession and conviction cannot erase grief. The law asks whether a crime can be proven. Families ask why their child is gone. Those are different questions. And sometimes the answers do not meet. Dion's trial would come in 1964. The courtroom would become the next stage of a story that had begun with missing children and hidden graves. The prosecution would present its case. The defense would respond. The evidence would be examined. And eventually, a verdict would come. Dion would be sentenced to death. For a moment, it might have appeared that the story had reached its final chapter. The killer had been caught. He had been convicted. He had received the harshest punishment available under Canadian law at the time. But history rarely ends where people expect it to. Dion would not be executed. His death sentence would later be commuted to life imprisonment. Nightmare would remain alive behind prison walls. Years passed. 1963 became 1964. 1964 became 1965. Then the decade changed. The names of the victims slowly disappeared from the front pages. New crimes replaced old ones. New stories occupied the attention of the public. But for the families, time could not erase what had happened. A child does not become less loved because years have passed. A missing voice does not become less missed. And a photograph does not become less painful simply because it has faded. Inside prison, Dion continued to live. Until November 17, 1972. Nearly a decade had passed since the murders. Dion was being held at Archambault Prison. Then another prisoner, Norman Champagne, attacked him. The weapon was reportedly a metal bar. The assault was fatal. And just like that, the life of Leopold Dion ended. There was no execution chamber. No final public spectacle. No state-administered death sentence carried out after years of appeals. Instead, his life ended inside the prison where he had spent his final years. His death closed one chapter. But it did not close the case in the hearts of those who had lost their children. Because the final irony of Dion's story is that he in fact may tempt people to describe his death as some kind of punishment. But justice is not revenge. And the death of one violent man does not undo the violence inflicted upon 4 children. It does not return Guy. It does not return Alain. It does not return Michel. It does not return Pierre. Their names remain important precisely because they existed before the crime. They were not born as victims. They became victims. There is a difference. And perhaps the most responsible way to tell this story is to keep that difference alive. Not to make Dion larger than the boys. Not to turn him into a legend. Not to romanticize his methods or his personality. But to understand how ordinary life was interrupted by someone who knew how to exploit trust. The story is frightening because it is not about a supernatural creature. There was nothing supernatural about Leopold Dion. He was human. He was capable of moving through society. He had a history. He had been imprisoned. He had been released. He could speak to people. He could persuade. He could deceive. And he could make children believe that an ordinary invitation was safe. That is far more frightening than any fictional monster. Because fictional monsters announce themselves. Real predators often do not. They wait. They look for vulnerability. They learn what people want to hear. And sometimes they offer exactly that. A photograph. A ride. A promise. A moment of attention. The child does not see the trap. The adult does. And that imbalance is what makes predatory crimes so devastating. The child is making a decision with incomplete information. The predator is making a decision with knowledge. That is not trust freely exchanged between equals. It is trust exploited. And once we understand that, the events of 1963 become more than a sequence of murders. They become a warning about how danger can hide inside ordinary interactions. A warning about how quickly a normal day can become a nightmare. A warning about how the consequences of a crime extend far beyond the moment itself. Because the victim's final moment is not the end of the family's suffering. It is the beginning. The family must continue. They must wake up. They must eat. They must work. They must answer questions. They must see other children growing older. They must watch birthdays arrive without the person who should have been there. They must carry photographs. They must remember a voice. They must live with a silence that no court can sentence away. And somewhere in that silence is the real weight of not the headlines, not the courtroom drama, not even the killer's confession. The weight is in 4 empty places. For childhoods interrupted. For families forced to live with an ending they never chose. And perhaps that is why, before we move deeper into the story, we need to slow down. We need to step away from the man who became infamous. We need to leave the prison cell, the interrogation room, and the courtroom behind. We need to return to the world before the disappearances. Because the most important question is not simply how Leopold Dion became a killer. It is how 4 boys became part of his path. Who were they? What kind of lives did they have? What did their families see when they looked at them? What dreams belonged to children who had no idea that their names would one day appear in newspapers and police records? And what was Quebec like in the spring of 1963, when these events unfolded? To answer those questions, we have to turn the clock back. Before the graves. Before the arrest. Before the confession. Before the courtroom. Before the nickname. There was a province filled with ordinary people living ordinary lives. There were homes with children inside them. There were parents who believed their sons would come back at the end of the day. There were streets that felt familiar. There were places where children could still move seem impossible to imagine. And somewhere within that ordinary world was Leopold Dion. A man with a criminal past. A man who had already been given another chance. A man who would soon become the center of one of the darkest criminal investigations in Quebec's history. But on the morning before the nightmare was fully understood, he was not a legend. He was not yet a name whispered with fear. He was simply a man. And the boys were simply children. That is how the story looked before anyone knew how it would end. That is how every tragedy begins. Ordinary. Quiet. Unremarkable. Until one person makes a decision that changes everything. And in the spring of 1963, Leopold Dion made that decision again and again. The next chapter takes us into the world he moved through. The Quebec of the early 1960s. The communities. The roads. The social atmosphere. The criminal justice system. And the history of a man whose first known conviction should have changed the course of his life. Instead, it became only the beginning. Because to understand the 4 murders, we must first understand the man who committed them. And to understand him, we must understand the world that allowed him to return. Only then can we begin to understand how 4 boys could disappear. The truth finally surfaced, it was already far too late. There are moments in a criminal investigation when the truth does not arrive all at once. It comes in fragments. A name written on a piece of paper. A description remembered by a frightened witness. A vehicle seen at the wrong place. A child who does not come home. A second child who disappears. Then a third. Then a fourth. At first, each fragment seems too small to carry the weight of what is coming. But investigators keep collecting them. They put them beside one another. They compare dates. They compare places. They compare descriptions. And eventually, the fragments begin to form a shape. By late May of 1963, that shape had a name. Leopold Dion. But before the police reached him, before his story began to unravel, there was something else happening in the communities where these children lived. People were beginning to look at familiar places differently. A road that had always been ordinary could suddenly feel unfamiliar. A parked car could attract attention. A stranger speaking to a child was no longer simply a stranger being friendly. Every adult who approached a child could be viewed through the lens of fear. That is what a series of child disappearances does to a community. It changes the meaning of ordinary things. The freedom that once seemed natural begins to feel dangerous. A child walking home alone is no longer simply walking home. A child who is 5 minutes late is no longer simply 5 minutes late. And every parent begins to imagine the worst. Fear spreads differently from information. Information moves through facts. Fear moves through imagination. Someone tells a neighbor that another boy has disappeared. The neighbor tells a relative. Someone remembers seeing a strange man. Someone else remembers a vehicle. Another person recalls an encounter that seemed insignificant at the time. Suddenly, everyone begins searching their own memories. Did I see him? Did my child see him? Was that man there yesterday? What was he doing? Was he watching the children? Was he following someone? The mind starts filling in blanks. Some of those memories are accurate. Some are not. But all of them are born from the same question. What is happening? And beneath that question was another one that was much more frightening. Who could do this? The answer was closer than anyone wanted to believe. Leopold Dion was not some unknown figure who had suddenly appeared from nowhere. His history already existed. It was recorded. He had already crossed the line between ordinary criminal behavior and a serious sexual crime, raping a 33-year-old female teacher in Pont Rouge. The conviction resulted in a life sentence. That should have been the dividing line. Before prison. After prison. A person who had committed a serious offense had been removed from society. The sentence was supposed to protect the public. But years later, Dion would be released. And that is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because society often wants to believe that prison creates a clear boundary. A dangerous person goes in. The public remains outside. Time passes. The offender is punished. Perhaps he changes. Perhaps he is rehabilitated. Eventually, the door opens. But the door does not simply open onto a blank future. It opens onto a person who carries his history with him. And in Dion's case, that history mattered. By 1962, he was back in the community under conditional release. Less than a year later, children were disappearing. When investigators eventually connected him to those deaths, the earlier conviction could no longer be viewed as an isolated chapter. It became part of a larger and darker pattern. But at the time, no one had the luxury of seeing the entire pattern. That is something that hindsight does to criminal cases. It creates clarity. After the crime, every detail appears significant. Suspicious behavior looks like a clue. Every decision can be examined under the harsh light of what eventually happened. But people living through the events did not know the ending. They were not reading the story from the final page. They were standing inside it. And inside that uncertainty were 4 families. 4 families who had no idea that their children would soon be linked forever by one of the most disturbing criminal cases in Quebec. Guy Luckenock, Anna Carrier, Michel Morel, Pierre Marquis. Their ages were different. Their personalities were different. Their families were different. But the thing that connected them was not something they had chosen. It was the person who crossed their paths. That is why their stories must be separated from Dion's. If the investigation is told only through the eyes of the offender, the victims become shadows. Their lives become short introductions before the killer enters the frame. But that is not what happened in reality. The boys did not exist because of the crimes. The crimes happened because someone decided to violate their lives. Before that, they were simply living. They woke up. They ate breakfast. They went outside. They spoke to people. They had interests. They had fears. They had people who loved them. The world was still open to them. Their weeks, those futures disappeared. The first known victim, Guy Luckenock, was 12. 12 is an age suspended between childhood and adolescence. Old enough to begin imagining independence. Young enough to still be protected by adults. Old enough to be curious about the world. Young enough to believe that the world is mostly safe. That mixture of curiosity and trust is one of the things predators can exploit. A child does not necessarily interpret an invitation the way an adult does. If an adult offers a ride, a photograph, a small adventure, the child may see opportunity. The adult may see vulnerability. The child sees a camera. The predator sees access. The child sees a stranger. The predator works to become familiar. And once familiarity is established, danger becomes harder to recognize. This is what makes Dion's alleged method so disturbing. There was no need for a dramatic confrontation at the beginning. The encounter could begin softly. A conversation. A proposition. A promise. Then movement away from familiar surroundings. That transition matters. A child who is surrounded by other people has witnesses. A child who is taken somewhere isolated has none. Distance becomes a weapon. Silence becomes a weapon. Trust becomes a weapon. And once the gains control, the 4 known victims were taken during a period of only a few weeks. That short span makes the case especially chilling. There was no long pause between crimes. No apparent period in which the offender simply disappeared from the public eye. The pattern continued. April. May. May again. Then May again. Each disappearance brought another family into the nightmare. And each new victim should have increased the pressure on investigators. Because every additional crime meant another opportunity to identify a pattern. But it also meant another child was already gone. The police were racing against something they could not see. A man who knew how to approach children. A man who knew how to make himself appear harmless. A man who had already been through prison and had returned to the community. And while investigators searched, Dion still possessed one enormous advantage. He knew what had happened. Everyone else was trying to find out. That imbalance is the foundation of many criminal investigations. The offender knows the location. The investigator knows only that there is a location. The offender remembers the route. The investigator has to reconstruct it. The offender knows the final conversation. The investigator must ask witnesses to remember the first. The offender knows where, and in the beginning, investigators did not have Dion's confession. They had to build the case without it. That is why the surviving boy mattered so much. A child who escaped provided something that a dead victim could no longer provide. A description. A memory. A human connection between the suspect and the pattern. That testimony helped move Dion from the world of possibility into the world of investigation. And once his name emerged, his past became impossible to ignore. The man they were investigating had already been convicted of sexual violence. He had already served a lengthy prison sentence. He had already been released. Now he was being investigated in connection with missing children. The stakes could not have been higher. On May 27th, Dion was arrested. The date is important. May 26th. Pierre Marquis disappears. May 27th. Dion is taken into custody. One day. That narrow gap would become one of the most significant moments in the entire investigation. But arrest did not immediately produce answers. A suspect can be arrested while the truth remains hidden. And Dion's truth was buried in more than one sense. It was buried in the memories of the victims. Buried in the places where the children had been taken. Buried beneath the ground where their remains would eventually cross from investigators. For weeks, the pressure continued. Questions were asked again and again. The investigators wanted details. Dion had details. They needed locations. He knew locations. They needed explanations. He had his own version of events. But confessions are complicated things. A confession can contain truth. It can contain self-serving explanations. It can contain omissions. It can contain details that investigators must independently verify. And in a case involving multiple victims, every statement creates another question. Is this true? Can it be confirmed? Where is the evidence? Where is the victim? What happened next? What happened before? Who else knew? Was anyone else involved? Eventually, Dion began to provide answers. And the investigation changed. The man who had been a suspect became a guide. He could point investigators toward places they had not yet found. The search became physical. The ground became evidence. The investigators were no longer asking only where the children had gone. They were asking where Dion had taken them. And every location he identified carried the possibility of another terrible discovery. Imagine the investigators arriving at one of those places. They do not know. They know why they are there. They know that somewhere beneath the surface may be the answer to a family's worst question. Is my child alive? At some point, that question receives an answer. Not the answer anyone wanted. The children were dead. The investigation now had bodies. It had victims. It had a suspect. It had a confession. But it still had to confront the courtroom. And the courtroom would demand something different from what the investigation had demanded. The investigation wanted to know what happened. The court had to determine what could be proven. Those are not identical tasks. This distinction becomes especially important in the case of Dion. He confessed to the killings of 4 boys, but he would not ultimately be convicted of 4 murders. The legal proceedings centered on the death of Pierre Marquis. That does not mean the other deaths suddenly became irrelevant. It means the criminal justice system had to work within the evidence available for prosecution. The distinction is essential. A confession is not the same thing as a conviction. An investigator's belief is not the same thing as a jury's verdict. A family's certainty is not the same thing as proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And a historical account must keep those lines clear. Otherwise, the story becomes simpler than the reality. The trial would come in 1964. The courtroom would become the place where the evidence, the confession, and the circumstances surrounding Pierre Marquis' death were examined. And eventually, the sentence would be death. But again, the story would refuse to end there. The death sentence would later be commuted to life imprisonment. Dion would remain alive. For years. Behind prison walls. The children would not. That contrast is difficult to escape. A murderer can continue aging. He can wake up in the morning, eat meals, speak to other prisoners, see seasons change, watch years pass. The victims cannot. Their age remains fixed forever. Guy remains 12. Alain remains 8. Michel remains 10. Pierre remains 13. This is one of the cruelest realities of violent crime. The victim's life stops. Everyone else's life continues. Parents grow older. Siblings grow older. Friends grow older. The world changes. But the photograph remains the same. The face never ages. The child remains frozen at the age when he was taken. And perhaps that is why old photographs can carry such enormous emotional weight in true crime cases. A photograph does not show the death. It shows the life before it. That is what makes it powerful, what the future holds. A smile that was never meant to become evidence. A face that could never have imagined that decades later, strangers would study the same image while trying to understand what happened. For the families, however, it was never a historical photograph. It was their child. Their son. Their memory. Their life. That is the part of the story that can disappear when crime becomes entertainment. The investigation is fascinating. The confession is disturbing. The courtroom is dramatic. The killer's psychology is compelling. But the center must remain the people whose lives were destroyed. That is where this story needs to return. Again and again. Because the name Leopold Dion became famous. The boys did not ask for fame. They deserved something better. They deserved ordinary lives. And ordinary lives are exactly what they lost. By the end of May 1963, the world around these families had changed. The police had a suspect. The suspect was in custody. The investigation was moving toward the truth. But the truth itself was horrifying. The children were not coming home. And somewhere in the middle of that realization, another question began to emerge. How could this have happened? How could a man with a previous conviction for sexual violence have returned to society? How had he been released? Was not known. And could the tragedy have been prevented? Those questions would become part of the legacy of the case. But they are questions that require context. To understand them, we have to go back much further than 1963. We have to go back to Dion's early criminal history. We have to examine the conviction that came in 1940. We have to understand the sentence, the years in prison, the eventual release, and the path that brought him back into a society where children were living ordinary lives. Because the man who appeared in the investigation in 1963 had not emerged from nowhere. His story had been developing for decades, and the first warning had already been written into the records. Years before Guy. Years before Alain. Years before Michel. Years before Pierre. There had already been a victim. There had already been a courtroom. There had already been a conviction. There had already been a sentence. And there had already been a decision to let Leopold Dion return to the world outside prison. That is the part of the story that makes the later murders so difficult to understand. The question is not simply why one man committed terrible crimes. The question is what happened after the first crime. What was learned? What was forgotten? What was believed? What was underestimated? Without fully understanding the danger that person may still represent. Those questions do not belong only to 1963. They belong to every era, every justice system, every community, every family that believes the institutions around them are there to keep their children safe. And that is why the story of Leopold Dion still carries weight decades later. Not because the killer deserves to be remembered, but because the consequences of failing to understand predatory behavior can last far longer than the person who commits the crime. Dion eventually died in 1972. The case eventually became history. The prison walls eventually closed around his name. But the four boys never became history to the people who loved them. Their absence remained present. Their birthdays still came. The seasons still changed. The world kept moving. That is the strange cruelty of time. Time heals some wounds. But some wounds simply learn how to live inside a person. And for the families of Guy, Alain, Michel, and Pierre, the spring of 1963 would always exist somewhere in the past, waiting to be remembered. A child leaving. A door closing. A family waiting. A clock moving. A phone call. A search. A name. The terrible realization that what they feared was true. The children were gone. The man responsible was in custody. But the story was only beginning to enter the public consciousness. The investigators still had work to do. The court still had to decide what could be proven. The defense would challenge the case. The prosecution would seek the harshest punishment available. And Dion would eventually stand before a judge with his future hanging in the balance. But before that courtroom, before the sentence, before the appeals, there was something the investigation had to do. It had to reconstruct the lives of the victims. It had to understand where they came from. It had to understand how they disappeared. And it had to place each boy back into the story as a human being rather than a statistic. That is where we go next. Because the four names at the center of this case deserve more than a number. Guy Luckenock was not simply the first victim. Alain Carrier was not simply the youngest. Michel Morel was not simply another name on a list. Pierre Marquis was not simply the boy whose death became the focus of the prosecution. Each one had a life. Each one had a family. Each one belonged somewhere. And each one left behind people who had to continue living after the world they knew had been torn apart. So before we look at the killer again, we will look at the boys. We will step into their world. The police reports for a moment. We will leave the prison. We will leave the courtroom. And we will return to a time when these children were still alive. When their futures were still open. When their names meant something entirely different. Not victims. Not evidence. Not statistics. Just 4 boys. 4 lives. 4 families. And a future that should have belonged to them. The tragedy of Leopold Dion is often remembered as the story of a predator who was finally caught. But that is only one way to tell it. The more important story is about what was lost before he was caught. The childhoods that ended. The families that broke. The questions that remained. And the 4 names that should never be reduced to the crimes committed against them. Because long after Leopold Dion disappeared behind prison walls, and long after his own life ended, one fact remained unchanged. He was not the most important person in this story. The boys were. And now it is time to meet them. Before the disappearances, there was a world. A world that did not know it was about to become the setting for a nightmare. It was the spring of 1963 in Quebec. The province was changing, but much of everyday life still moved at a slower rhythm than the one people would know decades later. There were no messages, no digital maps, no cameras quietly recording streets from every direction. If a child left home, there was no device that could tell a parent exactly where he was. If someone saw something suspicious, there was no way to capture it instantly and send it to hundreds of people. Information moved through voices, through telephones, through newspapers, through neighbors, through police reports. And when a child disappeared, the search depended heavily on people remembering what they had seen. A face, a vehicle, a conversation, a direction, a few words exchanged on the street. That was the world into which Leopold Dion returned after years behind prison walls. It was also the world in which children could move through their communities with a degree of freedom that would later become difficult for many people to imagine. Children walked. They played outside. They visited friends. They went places without adults. The boundaries of childhood were not necessarily defined by constant supervision. Parents trusted familiar streets. They trusted neighbors. They trusted the adults their children encountered. And that trust was part of everyday life. It was also precisely the kind of trust that a predatory person could exploit. To understand in 1963 as a place where everyone was constantly afraid, the opposite is closer to the truth. The horror of the case came partly from how ordinary everything looked. People woke up. They went to work. Children went about their days. Families made plans. The seasons changed. Spring arrived. And in that ordinary environment, something terrible was happening almost invisibly. The province of Quebec itself was undergoing a period of profound social transformation. The early 1960s were years of change, especially in Quebec's relationship with institutions, government, education, religion, and modern life. But social change does not mean that everyday life suddenly becomes unfamiliar. Old habits survive inside new eras. Communities still retain their memories. Families still know one another. People still recognize the faces on the street. And in smaller communities, that familiarity can be comforting. A person you see repeatedly becomes part of the landscape. The same roads. The same businesses. The same houses. The same people. Familiarity creates security. But familiarity can also create blind spots. When someone looks ordinary, people tend to treat them as ordinary. They do not constantly ask what that person did last. They do not assume that a man standing nearby has violent intentions. Most of the time, that instinct is perfectly reasonable. Society could not function if every stranger were treated as a potential murderer. But predators understand this. They live inside the assumptions that make ordinary social life possible. Leopold Dion had a history. That history was serious. Yet history can become distant. A conviction from years earlier exists in records. It exists in court documents. It exists in institutional memory. But it does not necessarily exist in the minds of ordinary people walking down a street. That distinction would become painfully important. Dion had first entered the criminal justice system long before the disappearances of 1963. In 1940, he was convicted of raping a 33-year-old female teacher in Pont Rouge. The conviction resulted in a life sentence. The words themselves carry an enormous weight. Life sentence. It sounds permanent. It sounds like the end of freedom. But a sentence is not always the end of a person's interaction with society. Years can pass. Policies can change. Decisions can be made. A prisoner can become eligible for release. And eventually, someone who once seemed permanently removed can walk outside the prison gates again. Release became one of the most consequential facts in the story. By 1962, he had been released conditionally. And in the following year, he would be connected to the deaths of 4 boys. The chronology is devastating. 1940. A conviction for sexual violence. Years behind bars. Release. 1962. Return to the community under conditions. 1963. Children begin disappearing. When viewed backward, the sequence seems almost impossible to comprehend. But history is rarely experienced backward. The people living through 1962 did not know what 1963 would bring. The people living through April 1963 did not know what May would bring. And the parents of the first missing child did not know they were standing at the beginning of a series. That is an important distinction. A historical timeline makes events look inevitable. Real life never feels inevitable. On any ordinary morning, no one wakes up knowing that the day will become the dividing line between one life and another. There is no announcement. No warning. The ordinary day simply begins. And for the families at the center of this story, one of those ordinary days would become the last day before everything changed. The landscape of the case also mattered. The countryside contained exactly the kind of spaces in which a person could disappear from view. Roads connected communities. Wooded areas created privacy. Abandoned or isolated structures could sit away from the attention of passers-by. A vehicle could travel from a populated area into a quieter one in a relatively short time. The distance between ordinary and isolated could be surprisingly small. That geography would later become part of the investigation. According to Dion's confession, the boys were taken to locations away from the immediate safety of their homes and communities. One of those places was an abandoned house in the Saint-Raymond area. To understand why that matters, imagine what isolation means to a child. A familiar street provides witnesses. A familiar neighborhood provides people who know the child. An unfamiliar building does the opposite. The walls do not know his name. The surrounding trees do not know his family. There may be no one nearby who realizes something is wrong. Isolation is not merely distance. It is the absence of protection. That was the environment in which Dion could exercise control. But there is another element that made his approach especially dangerous. He did not necessarily need to force a child to follow him. He could persuade. That difference is crucial. A violent abduction is immediately recognizable as vehicle creates a scene. People notice. People react. But if a child willingly walks toward a vehicle because he believes he is being offered something harmless, the moment can pass almost unnoticed. A boy gets into a car. Someone watching from a distance sees nothing unusual. The door closes. The vehicle leaves. And the danger disappears around the corner. The method was therefore dependent on perception. Dion needed to look ordinary. He needed to sound convincing. He needed the child to believe the interaction was safe. According to accounts of the case, photography became part of that approach. The idea of taking photographs gave him a reason to speak to boys. It created an excuse. It made the encounter feel purposeful. It transformed an unknown adult into someone who appeared to have a harmless interest. A camera can make a stranger seem less threatening. It suggests a hobby, a profession, a reason for being there. And to a child, the promise of being photographed can feel flattering. It can suggest that something about him is worth noticing. That small psychological shift can matter. The child is no longer thinking, "Why is this stranger talking to me?" He may instead be thinking, "He wants to take my picture." The conversation has been reframed. The stranger has created a role for himself and seem like a natural continuation. Come with me. Get in the car. There is a better place for the photograph. It is not the individual request that creates the danger. It is the sequence. One small decision leading to another. A child agrees to a conversation, then an invitation, then movement, then isolation. By the time the situation becomes frightening, the child may already be far from the people who could help him. This is why the Dion case is not simply a story about murder. It is a story about manipulation. The violence came later. The trap began earlier. And that distinction matters when trying to understand how such crimes can occur. The predator's first objective is often not violence. It is access. He needs proximity. He needs trust. He needs opportunity. Everything else follows from those conditions. That is what makes the early moments so difficult to reconstruct. There may be nothing visibly dramatic. A conversation. A smile. A question. An offer. A child agreeing to go somewhere. No one watching understands the meaning of the moment. Only the predator knows what he intends. And the child certainly does not. This imbalance of knowledge is one of the darkest elements participating in an ordinary interaction. The predator knows it is something else. Two people can stand in the same place while living in completely different realities. For one, it is an afternoon. For the other, it is an opportunity. For one, the future is open. For the other, a plan is already forming. And that is why the first moments of the Dion case are so important. The tragedy did not begin when the bodies were found. It began when trust was manipulated. It began before investigators arrived. Before the newspapers printed his name. Before the courtroom. Before the confession. The spring of 1963 also exposed another weakness. The difference between what a community knows and what institutions know. A parent might know that a particular person seemed strange. A neighbor might remember a vehicle. A child might remember a face. A police officer might have a report. But unless those pieces meet, they remain isolated fragments. One person has one piece. Another has another. The picture is incomplete. Modern technology has changed this process dramatically. But in 1963, investigators had to build connections manually. They had to talk. They had to compare. They had to travel. They had to search. They had to rely on forget. They misremember. They become frightened. They interpret events differently after learning what happened. A person who saw a stranger before the crime may remember the encounter differently after the stranger becomes a suspect. That does not mean the witness is lying. It means memory is complicated. This would make the surviving boy particularly important. He had not simply heard about Dion. He had encountered him. And he had escaped. That meant his memory had immediate investigative value. He could help transform a vague search into something more concrete. A man. A description. A possible identity. A direction. A suspect. And once Dion's name entered the investigation, his previous history became impossible to separate from the present case. The man being sought was not an unknown first-time offender. He had already been convicted. He had already served a sentence. He had already been released. That fact would later become part of the public discussion surrounding the case. People would inevitably ask whether his earlier history should have made authorities more cautious, whether his release had been appropriate, whether enough was known about the risks, whether the system had failed. These questions are difficult because they involve a fundamental tension. A justice system can punish. It can attempt rehabilitation, but it cannot predict the future with certainty. Every release decision contains an element of risk. The problem is that when that risk becomes reality, the consequences can be irreversible. A wrong prediction can cost someone years. A wrong prediction involving a dangerous offender can cost someone a life. In the Dion case, those consequences would be measured in children. For children, the first 12, the second 8, the third 10, the fourth 13. And while their families were trying to understand what had happened, the public was beginning to confront a different reality. The person responsible was not some distant figure. He was someone who had already been part of the justice system, someone who had been imprisoned, someone who had been released, someone who could walk among ordinary people. That realization changes the emotional temperature of a case. If the killer is a stranger from another place, people can tell themselves the danger belongs somewhere else. But when the offender is part of the same community, the fear becomes personal. People start looking at the faces around them. They begin wondering who they actually know. They wonder what can be hidden behind an ordinary appearance. They wonder whether a person can live among others while carrying secrets that no one else can see. That is, the psychology does not end with the victims. It spreads into trust itself. Parents become more cautious. Children are warned differently. Strangers are viewed differently. Communities remember. And sometimes an entire generation grows up with a case that becomes part of its collective memory. But before the name Leopold Dion became synonymous with the word monster, he was simply a man with a documented criminal history. That is perhaps the most uncomfortable truth of all. There was nothing magical about his ability to move through society. He did not need to transform into something else. He only needed to appear ordinary. And ordinary appearances are powerful. A person who looks dangerous receives attention. A person who looks harmless can move unnoticed. That is why the story of Dion remains disturbing even decades later. The danger did not announce itself. It blended into everyday life. It used the language of ordinary interaction. And the people around him had no way of seeing the future. The boys certainly did not. Guy did not know what was waiting for him. Alain did not know. Michel did not know. Pierre did not know. Their families did not know. The community did not know. And perhaps even the police, when the first disappearance was reported, could not have imagined that within weeks they would be dealing with 4 dead children and a suspect would eventually reveal that pattern. But at the beginning, there was only one missing boy, one family searching, one community waiting, and one spring day that would never be forgotten. That is where we must pause, because if we move too quickly from the setting to the crime, we risk losing the very people whose lives give this story meaning. The landscape matters. The justice system matters. Dion's history matters. But the boys matter most. Before they became victims, they were children growing up in a world that still seemed ordinary. They had homes. They had families. They had routines. They had futures. And those futures deserve to be imagined before they are described as lost. So now the camera of our story moves away from Dion. Away from the prison records. Away from the criminal history. Away from the man whose name would dominate the headlines. It moves toward 4 boys. 4 faces. 4 families. 4 lives unfolding in the same province at the same moment in history. The first is Guy Luckenock, 12 years old. His disappearance would become the first known killing in the sequence. Then Alain Carrier, only 8. The youngest of the 4. Then Michel Morel, 10 years old, taken on the same day as Alain, the boy whose death would later become the central focus of the prosecution. Their ages are easy to read: 12, 8, 10, 13. But an age is not a life. To say that someone was 12 tells us almost nothing about who he was. It does not tell us what made him laugh, what he was afraid of, what he loved, who he trusted, what he wanted to become, what his family expected to see when he grew older. Those are the details that disappear first when a human life is reduced to a criminal case. So before we examine how these boys died, we have to remember how they lived. Because this story should not begin with their deaths. It should begin with their existence. They were there. They mattered. They were loved. And for a brief moment in history, they were simply 4 boys living in Quebec. They had no idea that their names would one day be connected forever. They had no idea that an investigation would reconstruct their final days. They had no idea that a man named Leopold Dion would become part of the story of their lives. And they had no reason to know. Children are not supposed to understand the psychology of predators. They are not supposed to recognize criminal histories. They are not supposed to live as prisoners, to make mistakes, to learn, to become older, to discover who they are. That future was taken from them. And that is why the next part of this story must slow down. Because before we talk about the crimes, we need to talk about the children. Not as victims. As sons. As brothers. As friends. As boys who existed before the world knew their names for the wrong reasons. The case of Leopold Dion would eventually become a story about investigation, confession, trial, and punishment. But underneath all of that is something much simpler. For boys should have grown up. They did not. And the next chapter begins by asking the question that statistics can never answer. Who were they? To understand what happened to the 4 boys, we have to understand the world around them. Not the world as it looks in a history book. Not the world as it appears after the crime has already happened. But the world as it felt to the people who lived there. A world in which danger did not necessarily have a recognizable face. A world in which children could still disappear into the ordinary rhythm of the day. A world in which a man could have a criminal record and, after enough time had passed, become once again a person seen in public rather than a person seen only through prison bars. That was the world, and it was the world in which his victims lived. The early 1960s were a period of transition in Quebec. The province was moving through social and political changes that would reshape its institutions and its relationship with religion, education, government, and modernity. But transformation does not happen overnight. The old and the new exist beside one another. Traditional families lived alongside changing social attitudes. Small communities existed alongside growing towns. Old expectations remained strong even as a younger generation began to question them. For an ordinary family, those larger historical changes might have felt distant. Life was still measured by familiar things. Work. School. Church. Meals. Neighbors. Family visits. The changing seasons. Children coming home when the day was over. There was comfort in routine. And routine can create a powerful sense of safety. People learn the faces around them. They recognize the sound of familiar vehicles. They know which houses belong to which families. They know where children usually play. They know which roads lead somewhere and which ones disappear into quieter areas. That familiarity can make a community feel almost like an extension of the family home. Is that people who belong in the community are safe. The problem is that belonging and trust are not the same thing. A person can be familiar without being known. A person can live nearby without revealing what he is capable of. And a person's public appearance may have little connection to his private behavior. Leopold Dion's history demonstrated exactly that. He had already been convicted of a serious sexual crime. The justice system knew him. His conviction existed. His sentence existed. His years in prison existed. But once a person is released, society has to decide what that release means. Does the offender remain permanently defined by the crime? Can rehabilitation occur? Can someone who committed a terrible act eventually return to ordinary life? These are not easy questions. A justice system built entirely around permanent exclusion would be fundamentally different from one that allows for rehabilitation. But a system that allows release also carries the burden of assessing danger. That burden becomes especially heavy when the original offense involved sexual violence. In Dion's case, that earlier history would later appear horrifyingly relevant. He had been convicted in 1940 after the rape of a 33-year-old teacher in Pont Rouge. He had received a life sentence. But decades did not pass with Dion permanently isolated from society. 1962, he was conditionally released. That means the spring of 1963 did not begin with an unknown man suddenly appearing in Quebec. It began with a known offender already back in the community. That fact would become one of the most painful questions surrounding the case. How was he assessed? What conditions governed his release? What did authorities believe about his risk? What did they know? And perhaps most importantly, what did they not know? Historical records can sometimes provide answers. But even records have limits. They tell us what was documented. They do not always tell us what people believed privately. They show decisions. They do not always show every doubt behind those decisions. And after a tragedy, people naturally want a single explanation. Someone should have known. Someone should have stopped him. Someone should have seen the warning. But real failures are often more complicated. Sometimes the warning is there, but not understood. Sometimes information is fragmented. Sometimes one institution knows something another does not. Sometimes a person is judged through the standards of a different era. And sometimes the most important warning is only recognized after the disaster has already happened. The Dion case would eventually become one of those moments. Once the murders were discovered, his earlier conviction could no longer be toward the present. But before the murders, that connection did not necessarily feel inevitable. This is one of the central difficulties in studying criminal history. Hindsight creates a false sense of certainty. We know what Dion became. The people around him in 1962 did not. We know that 4 boys would be killed. The families did not. We know that Dion would eventually confess. The investigators initially did not. We know where the investigation would lead. The people reporting the first disappearance could not possibly know. The story only looks inevitable after the ending has already been written. For the people living through it, every day contained uncertainty. That uncertainty was amplified by geography. Quebec's smaller communities could offer privacy in ways that urban environments sometimes could not. There were roads that carried traffic during the day but became quiet later. There were wooded areas. There were isolated properties. There were abandoned structures. There were stretches of land where a vehicle could disappear from public view. And there were children who knew enough of their surroundings to move confidently through them. That confidence was normal. A child who grows up in a familiar area learns the landscape. He knows shortcuts. He knows where friends live. He knows where adults are usually present. He knows which places feel familiar. He only needs to move a child from a familiar environment into an unfamiliar one. That transition can happen quickly. A few minutes in a vehicle can change everything. The street disappears behind you. The familiar houses become smaller. The people who know you are no longer nearby. The child may still believe the situation is safe. The predator knows otherwise. And this is where Dion's use of photography becomes significant. The camera was not merely an object. It was a social tool. It gave him a reason to approach. It gave him a role. He could appear to be someone with a purpose. Someone looking for boys to photograph. Someone offering an experience. That kind of approach can be more effective than a direct threat because it allows the predator to avoid triggering immediate resistance. A child does not necessarily need to be convinced that the adult is trustworthy in some deep sense. He only needs to believe that the next few minutes will be harmless. That is enough. The danger lies in the gap between the child's expectation and the adult's intention. One believes he is going somewhere to have his photograph taken. The other knows that the photograph is only the beginning of something else. This is what investigators eventually had to reconstruct. Not simply where the bodies were found. Not simply how the boys died. But how the boys had been approached, separated from their normal surroundings. And how one man could move through the community without immediately being recognized as a threat. That last question is perhaps the most unsettling. What does a dangerous person look like? There is no reliable answer. A criminal may look frightening. Or harmless. Aggressive. Or polite. loud, or quiet. The appearance itself tells us very little. That is why Dion's story is so disturbing. He did not need to resemble the monster people imagined. He only needed to be convincing enough. And convincing people is often easier when the request itself sounds innocent. A photograph. A ride. A conversation. An offer of attention. The danger is hidden inside the sequence. The first step does not look like the final step. That is how manipulation works. A predator does not necessarily reveal the destination at the beginning. He creates a path. The victim takes one step, then another. And by the time the destination becomes clear, turning back may no longer be possible. For the families of the 4 boys, there would eventually be a terrible reconstruction of those final movements. Where did the child go? Who saw him? Who spoke to him? What time was it? What direction did he take? Who was the last person known to have seen him? What did that person remember? These questions are standard in a missing child investigation. But behind every question is an unbearable reality. The investigators are trying to reconstruct a child's last hours because the child cannot tell them himself. Every answer matters. A witness may remember a vehicle. Another may remember a face. Someone may remember a conversation. Someone else may remember nothing. Investigators have to determine which details are useful and which are coincidence. And in 1963, that process was largely manual. There were no digital databases capable of instantly comparing every report. No computerario facial recognition. No cell phone records. No GPS trail. No online network of cameras. A child's disappearance could become a race against time with very limited information. The first hours were critical. The first day was critical. The first description was critical. And yet, the Dion case demonstrates how quickly one disappearance can become something much larger. Guy Lukanak disappeared on April 20th. At first, that was one missing boy. Then May 5th brought a land carrier and Michel Morel. 2 boys on the same day. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. For boys in a matter of weeks. That concentration should have created an enormous investigative pressure. But the full connection between the cases would only become clear as information accumulated. A missing child investigation is built around possibilities. A murder investigation is built around evidence. The transition from one to the other is devastating. At first, there is still hope. Then evidence begins to remove that hope piece by piece. A witness says something troubling. A vehicle is identified. A suspect emerges. A location is searched. Something is found. And suddenly the family is forced to confront a truth they may have spent days refusing to believe. The child is not lost. The child is dead. There is no route home. No misunderstanding to resolve. No door that will open. No voice coming from the hallway. The investigation may move forward. The family cannot. Their lives have been permanently divided. Before and after. The case also demonstrates how important chance can be in an investigation. Dion was not caught simply because investigators already knew everything. A crucial piece of information came from a child who escaped. That survivor became a bridge between the unknown offender and the police. Without that encounter, the investigation would have continued. Perhaps another child would have disappeared. Perhaps the pattern would have taken longer to recognize. History can never know for certain. But the fact remains that one child's survival changed the course of the investigation. That is an important part of the story because it reminds us that the victims were not passive figures in a historical narrative. One child survived. He remembered. He spoke. And what he remembered helped investigators identify the man they were searching for. That testimony would eventually lead to Dion's arrest on May 27th. But even then, the investigation was not finished. A suspect was in custody. The missing children were still unaccounted for. And the families still needed answers. This is where the geography of the case would become important again. Dion knew where he had taken the boys. He knew which locations had been used. He knew where evidence might be found. Investigators did not. When he finally began confessing, the landscape itself became part of the interrogation. A location could confirm a statement. A discovery could validate a confession. A grave could transform suspicion into certainty. And each place carried its own emotional weight. The investigators were not simply finding evidence. They were entering the final chapter of a child's life. A place where a family answer they received would be the one they had feared. The body had been found. The child was dead. The uncertainty was gone. The grief could begin in full. That is a cruel paradox. Uncertainty is agonizing, but certainty can be devastating. As long as a missing child might still be alive, hope survives. Once the body is found, hope changes form. The family no longer searches for the child. They search for a way to live without him. And while the families were entering that unimaginable reality, investigators were beginning to build a case against Dion. His confession would become central. But the legal system could not simply accept the emotional weight of the investigation. It needed proof. The prosecution needed to establish a specific murder. The defense could challenge the evidence. The court would have to determine guilt according to legal standards. And that process would create another layer of pain. Because the investigation involved 4 boys, but the courtroom would focus on one. Pierre Marquis. That does not erase the other 3. It reveals the difference between the historical truth investigators believed they had uncovered and the legal truth that could be established in court. This distinction is essential. A man can confess to multiple crimes. A prosecutor may believe those confessions. Investigators may recover. The court still has to examine each charge individually. That is the foundation of criminal justice. The law does not convict someone because the story feels true. It requires evidence. It requires procedure. It requires a finding of guilt according to the applicable legal standard. In the Dion case, that process eventually resulted in a death sentence. But before that happened, the investigation had to pass through months of uncertainty. And behind every legal argument were 4 children whose lives could not be restored by any verdict. That is the uncomfortable boundary between justice and healing. A conviction can establish responsibility. A sentence can punish. A verdict can provide a degree of accountability. But none of them can reverse death. The families would still have to live with absence. The boys would still remain frozen in time. And Dion's eventual death in prison would not change that. Years after the murders, in 1972, he would be killed by another prisoner. But by then, the central tragedy had already been written. 4 boys had been taken from their families. The man responsible had been caught. The courts had acted. And the public had moved on. That last part is inevitable. Society cannot remain permanently focused on one tragedy. New events arrive. New crimes happen. New headlines obey the news cycle. For a family, a child does not become less important because newspapers stop printing his name. For a mother, a birthday does not become irrelevant because decades have passed. For a brother or sister, an old photograph does not become just a historical artifact. The child remains part of the family. The loss remains part of the family. And in that sense, the case never truly ended. The prisoner's story ended. The trial ended. The investigation ended. But the victims' families continued. That is why the setting matters. The Quebec of 1963 was not merely a backdrop. It was the world the boys knew. It was the network of roads and homes and schools and familiar faces that made their lives feel secure. It was also the environment in which Dion was able to move. The same world could feel completely different depending on where you stood. For a child, it was a world of exploration. For a parent, it was a world of responsibility. For a police officer, it was a landscape that had to be searched. For Dion, according to the evidence in his confession, it became a landscape in which he selected and isolated victims. One place. 4 perspectives. One terrible convergence. And that convergence is what makes the story so haunting. The world itself was not evil. The communities were not evil. The danger came from a person who knew how to use ordinary surroundings for extraordinary harm. That distinction matters because it prevents us from turning the story into a myth. Dion was not a supernatural monster hiding in the wilderness. He was a human being who made choices. The children were not foolish for trusting. They were children. The families were not careless because they expected their sons to come home. They were families living according to the norms of their time. And the community was not blind because it did not immediately identify the killer. It was dealing with incomplete information. The tragedy lies partly in how little anyone knew until it was too late. That is the central tension of the setting. Everything looked normal. Until it wasn't. A spring afternoon could become the last afternoon. A familiar road could become the route to a crime scene. A stranger could become a suspect. A missing person report could become a murder investigation. And a man who had once been imprisoned could become the center of a case involving 4 dead children. The pieces were there. But no one initially had the complete picture. Then, slowly, the picture came together. A boy disappeared. Then another. Then 2 on the same day. A survivor remembered. Police investigated. Dion was identified, confessed. And investigators followed his directions to the places where the dead were hidden. The world that had seemed ordinary was now evidence. Every location mattered. Every statement mattered. Every memory mattered. And soon, the names of 4 boys would be permanently linked to the name Leopold Dion. But there is another reason the setting must be understood before we move into the victims' stories. The environment shaped what people believed was possible. Children were given freedom because the world around them seemed familiar. Parents trusted because familiarity had usually rewarded that trust. And when danger finally appeared, it exploited the very assumptions that made ordinary life possible. That is not a failure unique to 1963. It is a vulnerability that exists in every generation. The technology changes. The streets change. The methods change. But the basic human desire remains the same. Parents want to believe their children are safe. Children want to believe adults are trustworthy. Communities want to believe familiar places are secure. And predators can exploit those beliefs. That is why the story of Leopold Dion still matters. Not because the past was uniquely dangerous, but because the mechanisms of manipulation remain recognizable. The details may change. The technology may change. The foundation of trust is much older than any one criminal case. In 1963, that exploitation ended the lives of 4 boys. And when the truth finally emerged, the community was forced to confront something it had never expected to see. A predator had been moving through an ordinary world. And the world had not recognized him. Not in time. Now the scene is set. We have the province. We have the era. We have the social atmosphere. We have the geography. We have the criminal history that preceded the murders. And we have the invisible thread connecting the past to the spring of 1963. But the story is still missing its most important element. The boys themselves. Their names have been mentioned. Their ages have been given. Their deaths have been described in broad terms. But that is not enough. Because if we speak only about the crimes, we risk allowing the crimes to consume the identities of the children. And they were more than what happened to them. Guy Luckenock was more than the first known victim. A land carrier was more than an 8-year-old name in a police file. Michel Morel was more than one half of the May 5th tragedy. Pierre Marquis was more than the murder charge that eventually reached the courtroom. They were 4 human beings. For children whose lives existed independently of Leopold Dion. And for that, we will not follow his movements. We will not examine his confession. We will not yet enter the courtroom. Instead, we will look at the boys. At the families waiting for them. At the ordinary lives that existed before the disappearances. At the details that make it possible to see them not as statistics, but as children. Because there is a difference between knowing that a child died and understanding what was lost when he died. One is a fact. The other is a human story. And to tell this case responsibly, we need the human story. The spring of 1963 began with children living their lives. It ended with 4 families learning that those lives had been violently taken away. Between those 2 points was a sequence of decisions made by one man. But the lives that matter most were the ones he destroyed. So now we turn toward them. 4 boys. 4 families. 4 unfinished futures. And the first name we need to remember is Guy Luckenock. There is a moment in every investigation when a place stops being a place. A road becomes a route investigators reconstruct. A house becomes a crime scene. A field becomes a search area. A patch of earth becomes the answer to a family's question. And a photograph becomes evidence. That transformation is one of the quiet tragedies of a murder investigation. Places associated with death. In the Leopold Dion case, the landscape of Quebec would become part of the story in precisely that way. The countryside was not merely where the crimes happened. It was where the victims' final movements disappeared from public view. It was where the distance between a familiar world and an isolated one could be created. And eventually, it was where investigators would search for the children. When Dion was finally taken into custody, investigators still had to understand what had happened after each boy disappeared. The arrest did not answer that question. The families did not know. The public did not know. Even the police had only fragments. The surviving boy had provided a crucial description. But a description could identify a suspect without explaining the entire crime. The investigation still needed to reconstruct the chain of events. Where did Dion meet the children? What did he tell them? Where did he take them? How did he isolate them? What happened after they were separated from their ordinary surroundings? And where had he hidden the evidence? These questions would eventually lead investigators into places that, before the murders, had no particular significance. An abandoned house. A secluded area. A piece of ground. A road that connected one place to another. To everyone else, these locations, they were pieces of a map. And to the families, they would become places they could never think about in quite the same way again. This is one of the strange ways violent crime changes geography. A place does not move, but its meaning does. Before the crime, a road is simply a road. Afterward, someone may remember it as the road where their child was last seen. Before the investigation, an abandoned building is simply an abandoned building. Afterward, it becomes part of a family's worst memory. Before the police arrive, a piece of woodland belongs to nobody's story. Afterward, it may be marked on a map, photographed, searched, and discussed in court. The physical landscape remains. The emotional landscape changes forever. And this emotional transformation was beginning to happen throughout the communities connected to the disappearances. Parents became more alert. Children were watched more closely. Conversations changed. The idea of a stranger approaching a child no longer seemed abstract. It had a name. Leopold Dion. And the name carried history. The public would learn about his previous conviction. They would learn that he had been imprisoned. They would learn that he had been released. They would learn that he had been taken into custody in connection with the missing boys. And as more information emerged, people would begin asking whether the danger had been. It is also dangerous if asked too simply. Because the past rarely provides the certainty people want. It is easy to say, after a tragedy, that someone should have known. But knowing that a person has committed a serious crime in the past is not the same as knowing exactly what he will do in the future. The challenge for any justice system is to distinguish between punishment and prediction. Punishment addresses what someone has already done. Prediction asks what someone might do next. Those are very different tasks. In Dion's case, the system had already punished him for a serious sexual offense. But the future was not controlled by the sentence alone. Eventually, he was released. And once he was outside prison, the responsibility for his behavior was no longer confined to prison walls. That is where the story becomes a question of risk. How much risk is acceptable? Who decides? What information should matter? How much weight should be given to a previous offense? Can rehabilitation be measured accurately? Can future violence be predicted? There are no easy answers. But the consequences of getting those questions wrong can be enormous. In 1963, those consequences had names. Guy, Alain, Michel, Pierre. For children whose futures had already been ordinary things. School. Work. Growing older. Making friends. Falling in love. Perhaps having children themselves. There was nothing extraordinary required for their lives to matter. They were children. Their lives mattered because they existed. And that is something a true crime story can sometimes lose when it becomes too focused on the offender. The killer has a beginning, a middle, and an end. He has a criminal history. He has motives to analyze. He has behavior to examine. He has interrogations. He has a trial. He has a sentence. He may even have a dramatic final chapter. The victims often receive none of that narrative space. Their lives are compressed into a few sentences. Age. Date of disappearance. Cause of death. And then the story moves on. But those few facts do not describe a person. They describe an ending. The boys deserve to exist in the story before that ending. That is why the next chapter will move slowly. We will not rush toward the violence. We will begin with life. Because there is something deeply important about seeing a victim as a complete human being. Once we do, the crime changes. It is no longer simply a murder. It is the destruction of a future. It is the sudden interruption of relationships that were still developing. It is the erasure of thousands of moments that would otherwise have happened naturally. A child would have become a teenager. A teenager would have become an adult. An adult might have become a husband, a father, a worker, a friend, a neighbor, an old man telling stories about his childhood. None of that happened. And the tragedy is not only that the victims died young. It is that no one knows who they would have become. That is what a violent death steals. Not only the present, the future. The future is invisible while we are living it. We assume there will be another birthday, another summer, another school year, another Christmas, another conversation, another chance to say goodbye. That assumption is so deeply embedded in ordinary life that we rarely notice it, until it disappears. For the families connected to the Dion case, the assumption disappeared one child at a time. First Guy, then Alan, then Michelle, then Pierre. And with each disappearance, the world became smaller. A family searches for a child, then another family searches, then another. The community begins to understand that something is wrong. The possibility of a predator begins to emerge. But the families do not experience this as a pattern. They experience it as personal catastrophe. That distinction matters. From the perspective of investigators, for cases may eventually become one investigation. From the perspective of a mother or father, there is only one case. Their child, their bedroom, their photographs, their memories, their unanswered questions. That is why the emotional impact of a serial crime is multiplied far beyond the number of victims. Each victim carries an entire network of relationships. Parents, siblings, grandparents, friends, teachers, neighbors. Each person connected to the child is forced to absorb a piece of the loss. And the more children disappear, the wider the circle of fear becomes. People begin asking whether their own children are safe. The parents of other boys begin watching more closely. A harmless invitation becomes suspicious. A stranger's friendliness becomes something to evaluate. A child who does not come home immediately becomes a source of panic. The entire community begins living with a question that no one wants to ask aloud. Could it happen again? For a period in another child had already escaped. Another had already been killed. Another family was already grieving. And another disappearance could have happened at any moment. This is why the eventual arrest of Dion on May 27th was so significant. It did more than identify a suspect. It potentially interrupted the sequence. It stopped the man investigators believed was responsible from continuing to move freely through the community. But the arrest also created a new problem. What had happened to the children? The police needed to know. The families needed to know. And Dion knew. That knowledge gave the interrogation an extraordinary importance. The investigators were not simply trying to prove that he was suspicious. They were trying to find the dead. At that point, the landscape itself became a witness. Dion could describe places. Investigators could travel to them. They could search. They could uncover evidence. And eventually, they would recover the remains of the children. Each discovery would close one question while opening another. The family now knew the child was dead. But how? Why? What had he experienced? What had happened in his final moments? Some of those questions might be answered. Others might never be. There is no investigation capable of returning every lost detail and partly unknowable. That uncertainty can become part of grief. Families can spend years imagining what happened. They may return to the same unanswered question. What was my child thinking? Was he frightened? Did he know? Did he call for me? Those are questions no verdict can fully answer. And perhaps that is one of the cruelest aspects of murder. The offender may know what happened. The victim's family may never know everything. The person who caused the suffering possesses information that the people who loved the victim desperately want. That imbalance can continue long after the suspect is convicted. In the Dion case, the confession provided investigators with information. But a confession does not necessarily provide emotional closure. Knowing where a body was buried is not the same as knowing every detail of a child's final moments. Knowing who was responsible does not explain why the victim was chosen. Knowing the method does not explain the fear. And knowing the date does not make the day easier to remember. The law can answer one question. Who is responsible? It cannot answer every human question. Why did this happen to my child? Why my son? Why did he trust that man? Why was he not protected? Why was the offender allowed to return? Why did no one see the danger sooner? Those questions visible aftermath of violent crime. And that aftermath began long before Dion eventually died in prison. The case itself would continue through several stages. The investigation, the confession, the recovery of the bodies, the prosecution, the trial, the death sentence, the commutation to life imprisonment, and finally, Dion's own death in prison in 1972. But each stage belongs to a different part of the story. For now, we remain in 1963. The suspect has been arrested. The truth is beginning to surface. The community is beginning to understand the scale of the tragedy. And the names of 4 boys are becoming permanently connected. But there is still one thing missing. Their individual stories. The setting has given us the world. Now we need the people who lived in it. We need to imagine the boys not through the eyes of the police, but through the eyes of the people who knew them. That means slowing down. It means resisting the temptation to make every sentence about the killer. It means remembering that Dion entered their stories. He did not create them. Their lives existed before him. They had histories before the murders. They had relationships before the investigation. They had identities before the newspapers needed a headline. Guy was 12. Alan was 8. Michelle, those numbers are the first facts we know. But they are only the doorway. Behind each number is a child. And behind each child is a family. And behind each family is an entire world. The tragedy of the Dion case is therefore much larger than 4 deaths. It is 4 worlds suddenly altered. For sets of parents forced to confront an unimaginable absence. For childhood stopped before adulthood. For futures that can only now exist in imagination. And perhaps the best way to understand that loss is to imagine what should have happened instead. Guy should have turned 13. Alan should have grown older. Michelle should have become an adolescent. Pierre should have become an adult. They should have had ordinary problems. Arguments. Homework. Embarrassing moments. Bad days. Good days. First jobs. First loves. Failures. Successes. They should have discovered that life is rarely as simple as childhood makes it seem. They should have had the opportunity to make mistakes and learn from them. Instead, their lives became fixed at the moment when violence interrupted them. That is what makes the case so difficult to reduce to history. History moves forward. The victims cannot. The world changed after 1963. Society changed. The justice system changed. But the ages of the 4 boys did not. They remained forever 12, 8, 10, and 13. That is the silent cruelty of a photograph. Everyone else grows older. The face in the picture does not. And perhaps that is where we should leave the setting. Not with Dion. Not with the police. Not with the prison. But with the 4 boys standing at the edge of a story they never knew they were entering. The spring air. The familiar roads. The ordinary rhythm of the day. A child leaving home. A parent expecting him back. The world continuing as though nothing has changed. And somewhere nearby, a man is watching. A man with a history that should have remained behind prison walls. A man who knows how to approach children. A man who understands that trust can open doors. At first, no one sees the danger. That is the defining characteristic of what is about to happen. The danger is invisible until it is too late. The first child disappears. Then another. Then 2 more. The community begins to understand. The police begin to connect the pieces. A survivor speaks. A suspect is identified. An arrest is made. And eventually, the ground gives up its secrets. But before the courtroom begins, there is a human story that deserves to be told. The story of 4 boys who were alive. And so we turn away from the landscape. We turn away from the institutions. We turn away from the man who would become known as the monster of Pont Rouge. We turn toward the photographs. Toward the families. Toward the memories. Toward the ordinary details that existed before the crimes. Because the most respectful way to tell a story about murdered children is not to begin by asking how they died. It is to ask who they were while they were alive. That is where the next chapter begins. With Guy Luckenock, 12 years old. A boy whose life should have been much longer than the few weeks that remain in the historical record. Then Alan Carrier, 8 years old. Still at an age when childhood should have been protected rather than exploited. Then Michelle Morel, 10 years old. A child whose disappearance on the same day as Alan would make the nightmare even more difficult to dismiss as coincidence. And finally Pierre Marquis, 13 years old. The oldest of the 4 known victims, and the boy whose death would become the centerpiece of the prosecution against Dion. 4 boys. 4 names. 4 families. And 4 stories that begin long before the stories. Not as statistics. Not as evidence. Not as names in a criminal file. But as lives. Because the true measure of what was lost cannot be found in the sentence handed down to Leopold Dion. It can only be understood by imagining everything those boys should have had. And everything that was taken from them.